All right, guys, I need to give you a little peek behind the curtain about a change that we just made. So if you go all the way back to the beginning of this podcast, so this would have been 2017 when we launched. Before the podcast started, it's like, okay, I need to have some intro, outro music for the podcast. But even at the time, you couldn't just go into AI and talk into your phone and all of a sudden get this awesome music. You know, this was a billion years ago. And so I had to come up with something that was going to be kind of the feel that I wanted, right? And as you've all heard me talk about a million times up to this point, I wanted it to be Christian metal. Right. But at the time, like you would go to these websites that had this unlicensed music and it just wasn't really good. And so I actually reached out to the band August Burns Red and I said, hey, I'm launching this podcast. This is what I think it's going to be. You know, I don't know if it's ever going to be anything. It's probably never going to be very big, but it'd be awesome if I could use some of your music. And JB, the guitarist from August Burns Red, is like, yeah, sure, go ahead and use it. And so for the first several hundred episodes of the podcast, we were using the August Burns Red music. And then we had to make a switch because, you know, we realized at the time, you know, I was trying to get monetized on YouTube and I kept having these issues. And one of the problems that I was having is I was using August Burns Red's music, but August Burns Red doesn't own their music, right? The music is owned by the label's owned by some conglomerate, and so I couldn't really technically get permission from them to use their music. And so we switched to using the song Perpetua by Holy Name, which has been what we've used for the last several hundred episodes, because they're with Face Down Records, and I thought at the time that, you know, Face Down, they actually own the rights to this. They're the ones that gave me permission. We're good to go. Now, we just kind of operated understanding that, or with that understanding rather. And then along the way, we had been denied monetization via YouTube and then denied again. And we had applied so many times and we would get denied without any type of an explanation. But then out of nowhere, like a couple of months ago, we get approved for monetization. But then when we went and looked at all of our episodes, we knew the August Burns Red episodes were lost because the only way you could monetize those is if you really like cut off the intro outro, which kind of messes up the flow of the show. But then with Perpetua by Holy Name, we were still getting copyright strikes on those episodes. And it's like, hey, what's the deal here? We have permission. And so we went to Google and we're like, hey, we have permission to use this, blah, blah, blah. Even the label was trying to get a hold of YouTube and just tell them like, hey guys, you know, we've given this guy permission. We want him to use this music. And yet the copyright strike was upheld because I guess Face Down is owned by some conglomerate, blah, blah, blah. So it became this big, huge mess. And so in order to kind of move forward, we wanted to make sure that we had some music that still honored kind of the vibe that we wanted to go with, but where we weren't going to get a copyright strike. And so what I was trying to search for were these Christian bands that, you know, own their own music, right? So that's kind of a new thing with kind of the new distribution that we have with streaming and social media and all these kinds of different things. A lot of bands now, when they're first starting out, they're not just trying to get on a label and get on a 360 deal, which, you know, super duper takes advantage of them. They're just trying to get the music out there. And so they own all their own music. And so there's a Christian metal band that I've liked for a long time now, for a couple of years, and they're still pretty small. Right? There's not a whole lot of people that know them unless you're really into the Christian metal space. And that band is called Awaken. And so they're a band out of Texas. And there was a song, my favorite song of theirs, is a song called Conqueror. And so it's got a very awesome intro. I love the outro. And so what I did was like, okay, I got to check all my boxes this time. So I actually reached out to the band. I talked to the main guy on the phone and I'm just like, hey, look, like I want to make sure that we can actually do this on the up and up. Like, do y'all own all your own music? And so shout out to Carl Shedd because, you know, we talked it out over the phone. He's like, no, we own all of our own music. Even within, you know, the settings, you can say, hey, we want people to be able to use our music. There's no copyright strike or anything like that. So as of right now, unless something changes or unless YouTube and Google go crazy on us, the new intro outro music for the podcast is going to be the song Conqueror by Awaken. And I just love, you know, even hearing from Carl about his heart for this music, because it's like, look, we just want to make brutal music that praises God. And you know, that just speaks to everything in my heart. But I did want to go ahead and just read the lyrics to the entire song because you're not really going to get it, obviously, because we're just taking a snippet from the beginning and a snippet from the end. But let me go and read the lyrics. Deceiver, you are the fallen, the accuser spewing vitriol, distorting truth, all to corrupt me. You're the progenitor liar, but I am more than a conqueror. Conqueror, get behind me, devil, for I am royalty. I am a son of the king. Your pain is what I desire. For the wages of sin you have wrought on humanity. Your screams I long to hear at the end of days, suffering for eternity. Know your place and slither back to the hell you came from, or find yourself crushed under the weight beneath my heel. Your annihilation brought forth by the resurrection. Who do you think you are? I have been washed by the blood, so bite your tongue before you speak to me. Your pain is what I desire, for the wages of sin. You have wrought on humanity. Your screams I long to hear at the end of days, suffering for eternity. How dare you speak to me with everything you've done? Your dominion of death, beaten by the Son of God. Burn in hell, burn in hell. I mean, guys, maybe you work out or run sprints listening to Hillsong or Bethel or some nonsense like that, but my goodness, doesn't that just hit a little bit different or a lot a bit different? And so again, even at the end, you might even hear the scream of burn in hell, and you're like, wait a minute, that sounds really mean and judgmental. Aren't you not supposed to say that? So chill out, turn your fundamentalist side of your brain off just a little bit and realize that this is the type of music that speaks to guys that are wired a little bit different, guys that are wired like this. Because again, Christian metal music is never going to be super mainstream. That's just not really something that it's for. But this is another form of worship music. Worship is not just CCM, contemporary Christian music, stuff that you hear on Air One or, K-Love or any of those types of things. There are many different forms of Christian praise and worship music. Christian metal is one of those. So guys, if you're listening to this, just realize that recently they released their first full-length album. So guys, if you're listening to this on time, they just came out like a week ago. So check out Awaken. Listen on Spotify, become one of their monthly listeners. Listen on Apple Music, wherever you get your stuff. So guys, enjoy the brand new intro-outro of Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. Mike, welcome to the studio, baby.
Dude, thank you. I'm really impressed. Not that I wasn't expecting you to have a professional setup, but this is amazing, man.
Well, I will tell you, part of it is because, when did I come down and do your show?
It's been several years.
It's been maybe 5 years, maybe even longer. And so that was the first studio I had ever been in.
Oh, really?
Right? Like a full-on studio that was set up in a room that was dedicated for that purpose. And that was also the day whenever you had one of your meat missiles attack me. So maybe we can talk about that. And that per my request, by the way, which I did request that. And so that kind of put it in my head. But to be honest, at the time, I was recording. I'll show you downstairs. I was recording in a closet. Yeah. Downstairs, no video.
Well, yeah, I think it makes sense. When I first started, it was at my house, just at a desk. And, I think, for anybody that wants to start a show, it doesn't make sense to go full bore until you've done it, A, long enough to know that you enjoy doing it, and B, that it's worth doing, So I think that's the natural progression. And I also think it helps you or kind of makes you appreciate, once you do get a dedicated space to it and it's all set up, then I think it's just that makes you a little more proud to have it the way it is. But
when I feel like people now, they try to cheat the system a little bit. They try to skip ahead. So people will come and see my setup and they're like, oh, okay, so I just need to, how much did this cost? And, how did it take to set it up? And I'm like, bro, you don't have a name for your show yet. Yeah. Because, there was a very small closet, which is now in my youngest room, where the closet, Mike, was just big enough for me to come in and squish behind and shut the door. And I would just have my laptop sitting there and a little blue microphone from Amazon, $50 microphone. Yeah. That was the first several hundred episodes of this podcast. Then I moved to a larger closet across the hallway so that I could bend and move as I was still not doing video. And then the next one was that little nook right there that you can see. Yeah. That's where I would film for a lot of time. Oh, okay. But my light was the window, right? And so it's it would be super harsh.
Oh, it's
and
cloudy. We can't record today.
And if I recorded at night, I would just turn on the overhead light. And it was I just looked like I had jaundice or something like that. Yeah. And so setting up over here and doing all this, this was such a progressive thing, even when we knew the show was working and everything was working. But even the table, we had one donor that's Kyle, love the shot, love everything. I can tell you got that table off of Facebook Marketplace. Can I please get you a table? And I was like, oh, okay. And so we had Sorinex make us this awesome table. Awesome, and, shout out to Landon, who works for Church 1122 with Joby, and he came out here and hooked it all up. And so it's just I just like seeing the progression of this show, the progression of your show and the things you're doing. Cause I think you're on your third or fourth iteration of your studio setup now. Yeah. And so for you even it's not really a straight line path to go from the SEAL teams to doing multimedia podcasting interview style stuff. And
well,
so
it is now. I think it's part of the Bud's requirement.
You got to write a book and you got to have a podcast. Yeah.
I mean, it was certainly nothing that I ever set out to do or considered doing. And, it's hard to believe. I mean, I've been doing it for 8 years now. And back when I first started, there were, of course, far fewer shows in existence. But, it kind of started with the first book that I wrote. I went on a lot of interviews and was on other shows, and I just got a lot of messages and comments of people saying, like, hey, I watched your episode with whoever, and have you ever thought about starting your own? And I was like, not really, I just kind of brushed it off for a couple of years. And then finally I was just like, well, maybe I'll give it a shot. That coupled with, it was right after Trump's first election. And I remember seeing like the polarity between the way he talked and conducted himself in those early campaign debates and interviews and stuff, and as brash and kind of unpolished and all over the place as he kind of was. The one thing that stood out is he was brutally honest, and even if you disagreed with everything that he said or hated him or whatever, it was very clear that he said what was on his mind, and that was pretty diametrically opposed to everybody else on the stage he was with, and he ended up winning. And to me at that time, it's hard to even think 10 years ago, the way our culture was, kind of mainstream media and even within the podcast space or whatever, it was so politically correct, and it was just getting worse and worse. I feel like we've kind of come out of that spell to a large degree, which is a pleasant surprise. But so at that time, the two things were, a lot of people were asking about it, and I realized that, or it seemed like the public was starved for just honest, raw conversation. And so I just figured, I'll give it a shot and see how it goes. And that was 8 years ago, So that's always really been the backdrop, I guess, for why I wanted to do it, why I continue to do it, is one, I really enjoy sitting down, with interesting people and getting to spend a few hours asking them whatever I want and hear their incredible stories. But also it's a nice outlet for me to, kind of continue that drive I have to communicate with the public in a more honest and raw, face value fashion.
Well, and you mentioned having an outlet. So we started this podcast, it would have been 2017. So we're in year 9 of the podcast, year 10 of the ministry. And again, now people are trying to start a podcast so it can be a career.
Yeah.
I mean, 8-9 years ago when we're doing this, like this was like, oh, this could be a cute hobby, like a fun little side gig. And that was all I ever thought it was going to be. But, even going back, it's interesting you bring up like kind of what the zeitgeist of culture was around language. You would get into these, or I would get in these Facebook spats with people about important subject matters or subject matters that aren't that important. And how it feels like you spend all day thinking about, oh, how are they going to respond? Are they even going to respond? And then boom, they respond. And then you just have to hit the reset button and you got to think of your well-crafted response. And I felt like me being able to do the podcast, I could get things off my chest without arguing with some random person that may just be an acquaintance, someone I maybe haven't even seen since high school. And here I am, doing this back and forth where no one changes their opinion. But I could think about a particular topic or philosophy or something happening in culture or in the news cycle. I could talk about it, and then I could kind of like turn that part of my brain off and like focus somewhere else. And then obviously we expanded with doing interviews, and then the forging table, the round table Bible discussion. We've got, Ask a Pastor. We've got, it was from the Senate with Mark Wayne Mullen, but now he's in the cabinet. So we're still trying to figure out what we're going to do with that moving forward. But it just allows you to kind of keep your mind sharp. And that's where I feel like, with everyone trying to get their opinions out there, like Mike, I don't know what it is for you, because I'm sure you get a lot of advice on how to build a show. But when people ask me, they're like, hey, Kyle, I'm building a show. What's your advice? Typically, my advice starts with, you probably shouldn't have one.
Yeah.
I was like, if you don't have something interesting to say, or if you can't get access to interesting people that will say things that they want to say, because there's people with huge podcasts that suck at interviewing, but they have awesome people that they talk to. But it's like, if you don't have some sort of unique perspective or a really, really good creativity or a voice behind something, it's like, bro, there's six or 7 million podcasts out there. Like, we don't need another one.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I would say, you know, I try to, I would, if you want to say live my life or kind of a fundamental principle that I always try to adhere to is kind of piggybacking off of from a faith perspective of non-judgmentalness and not just thinking of it that way, but legitimately wanting to come across that way, you know, is because it's, you know, to me, it's like whether it's respect or love or judgmentalness, whatever, is that it doesn't matter if I think I'm being judgmental or respectful or whatever. It's how the person is receiving it, you know. And so, you know, I do get asked that quite often. And my response is always, it's cautionary, similar to what you just mentioned, is that, hey, it's a tough market to break into at this point. You really need to have kind of all your ducks in a row and put yourself in a potential viewer standpoint, is that if they're at a bus stop scrolling through YouTube, like, what's going to grab their attention? What are you bringing to the table that's going to grab their attention that anybody else isn't? That's a hard thing to do at this point, you know, and kind of the same advice that you give. But I also couch that with, but at the end of the day, if it's something you want to do it, you know. Yeah. Just don't put all your eggs in that basket professionally. I wouldn't spend a ton of money. You can go a long way with angles and lighting and understanding kind of the basic principles of cinematic photography and get a lot out of them. I mean, you can use your phone at this point. A new iPhone can take, especially like with the Blackmagic app. I mean, you can get production quality with one light, an iPhone, and a chair with a decent distance to a background, and have pretty professional looking stuff with a $80 Rode mic, you know. And so just start small, you know, and check those two boxes, which is you enjoy doing it and it's worth doing, you know. And so I try to kind of pass that on to everybody, but it is a tough you know, industry to continue to be in year after year. And, you know, I imagine with you, I don't know what your schedule is for, you know, releasing content, but it can be a little daunting when, you know, when you have to do it every so often from an advertiser standpoint. And, you know, the contractual obligations, once you get to a point where you have sponsors and it's financially really worth continuing to do, that kind of takes some of the fun out of it, I think. You know, for me at least, it makes it more work than just wanting to do it for the principle of doing it. But
yeah, I'd say for us, I've tried to make more of an ecosystem, as opposed to, because we've had some offers to do some ad spots and for some different things, and I just said no. It was like, hey, you're just saying no to money. But I'm like, okay, let's look at the long-term sponsors of this show and the people that we worked with. Origin, Jocko Fuel, Primal Beef, and, you know, we've had G Seasoning, and we've had, you know, we did some stuff with Dawson Knives. We've, Mountain Tough has been a big one that we've done for a long time. But I'm thinking in terms of like, okay, so who is an Undaunted Lifer, right? So if you know, these marketing and PR companies, they always try to make an amalgamation of who your audience is, and then they give them a name and then they try to describe them. But I'm like, okay, this person's probably lifting, right? And so Sorinex, right? You saw my Sorinex rack downstairs, so maybe they have Sorinex stuff. Well, now they're done lifting, so they need to get some supplements in their body, so they're going to take in some Jocko Fuel. All right, they're going to get ready for work. They're putting on their jeans and boots. Okay, it's probably going to be Origin boots. Okay, they're going to have some lunch. What are they going to make? Probably some steak or buff or some, you know, ground meat or something like that. Okay, so there's Primal Beef. You know, they're putting a knife in their pocket, or they're throwing it in their bag or their work bag or something like that. Okay, let's make sure it's a Dawson. And then they're going to jiu-jitsu that night. What gi are they grabbing? Okay, they're going to obviously grab the American-made Origin gi. And so I'm trying to, like, and even like while they're in the gym, what are they doing? Like, well, they're probably doing Mountain Tough, right? Because they're not their own trainer, but they've got their garage gym out, and so they just turn on the app or put it on the television, and that's what they do. So like a gambling site or a shampoo or like, you know, something like that, it doesn't really fit inside of the ecosystem. And so for us, we release minimum 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. And so I'm not having to be beholden to a particular person. And that's what we tell people all the time. I'm like, look, you guys donating, that is the lifeblood of what we do here, right? Because, guys can donate to the Daily Blade, which is, tax deductible. But if they donate to Undaunted.Life, like, we're an LLC, it's like there's no tax break. They're doing that because they want to see content like this continue to get out there. Yeah. But there's not some nameless, faceless they group that's like, okay, here are the products you're going to push for the next 3 months. Here's the script you're going to read. That's another thing for my ads. I don't take scripts.
Yeah.
I'm like, tell me the high points of the things that we want to hit. I'm going to make sure I use the product so I can have my own way of talking about it. I don't keep the ad to 60 seconds. I was like, I'll talk about this for as long as I want to talk about it. It may be a 2-3 minute long ad, right? Logos Bible Software ad that I did was like 2.5 minutes long. And I just feel like it's almost like more, people take it more seriously, because that's probably the differentiating point that's hard for you, even with your show, Mike, is like, how do you differentiate from other people doing the same thing? And can you continue to stay true to yourself and honest to what you're trying to put out there?
Yeah, I'd say for the advertising aspect, I agree. I think there's always a fine line between, making sure that the show is worth doing versus turning into the ShamWow guy. Now, I would totally do ShamWow on this show. So I use ShamWow.
Hey, Mr. My Pillow guy or something like that, like hook it up.
Yeah. But yeah, so my metric similarly in maybe less of a protocol fashion or path is, it's either something I have used, do use, or would use,
Yeah.
And so similarly, like, I'll get a lot of advertisers that I turn down because it's just not stuff that I would use or believe in, gambling or gaming or stuff like that. I never do those, even though they offer it a lot, So, I do think that that's important. And I think it actually does go beyond just the advertisements themselves. I think, your credibility is not limited to advertisements only, And so I think, at least for me, I know, like, if I'm watching a creator that I like their content and they start doing advertisements for things, I mean, that makes me automatically think, well, if I don't necessarily trust your word on this product because I know you don't use it,
that's right.
Now I'm far less likely to trust your opinion on everything that you're talking about, So it is related, it is important, but it is a fine line, or can be tricky sometimes, I think, with figuring out what to do and how to do it.
Well, and so for you, as you approached your show, Mic Drop podcast, and all the different things, like, you, again, like some people, whenever I'm telling them whether they should or shouldn't start a show, it's like, they think in terms of seasons. Okay, like, I'm going to work really, really hard for 6 weeks, and then I'll take 6 months off, and then I'll do a season 2. It's like, no, you just need to burn the ships, and you're either going to do this or you're not. You're either doing it because you love it and you want to, or you feel guided to do it. But for you, like, as you've evolved as a podcast host, or, putting things out there, like, what have you kind of learned about your own style, about what makes the most sense? Because the thing that's pretty common about, you can listen to, a mic drop from this week or a mic drop from 5 years ago, is you're pretty consistent. The format is pretty consistent, and your honest, fervent, creative take of how to ask questions or how to get something out of the guest, it's all the same. And so you're not trying to reinvent the wheel because the algorithm on Instagram changed. So, like, how did you kind of like get into your, like, where you could run in that way? So
for me, the kind of benchmark principle has always been, I guess, a couple of things. There's not a single or a singularity as far as that goes. But to me, the keys are, making sure that the episode is about the guest. There's a fine line, to, like, I guess, reconciling being the guy that's just sitting there like a robot asking questions and not having any follow-up, versus, there's some creators out there, I think, that it feels kind of obvious that the show is more about what they think about what the guest is saying and whatever. And to each their own, everybody does what they want to do. But for me, it's always been that kind of starts with, I want to make sure that the show is about the guest. I want to give them an opportunity to share their story, to answer the question, to give their take. And if it makes sense for me to add anything to it, then I will. If it doesn't, I don't. The second part of it that I think is, from my perspective, is very crucial to being a good interviewer, which is listening to understand and not to respond. So like, I'll never when I'm drafting my outline for questions, sometimes I'll stick to it fairly closely. Sometimes I use almost none of it. It just, I kind of let the conversation go where it's going to go, but also understanding that there are points where you may have to reel somebody back in, or, kind of re-pivot back to, whatever you were talking about or whatever. But I think it's the thinking through what they're saying and trying to understand what they're saying, and not having some canned response. Like, even if it's somebody I know is probably going to say something that I either disagree with, or we have something that we're at odds with subject matter wise, I never, leading up to the interview, think about what I'm going to say or how I'm going to say it. I always let it come off the cuff, even if I have to take a second to think about it as they're saying or whatever. Like, I want to understand them first. And then I always try to have a very off the cuff, authentic and kind of organic response to it. And that's just how I kind of live my life. I mean, that's how I talk to people. So the way I talk to people on my show is really no different than the way I talk to them in person, or, behind closed doors, professional, personal relationship, whatever. But,
well, and that was the experience I had when I came on Mic Drop, however many years ago that was, because you're exactly right. There are interviewers that you can tell that no matter who they're having on, whether it's a media figure, a celebrity, a ball player, or an author or something like that, it's like, okay, how can I make this person say the thing that will allow me to hit my soundbite?
Yeah.
Or they do the gotcha thing, right? Well, in chapter 3, you said this, but in chapter 8, you said that. Well, that's an inconsistency and blah, blah. Whereas the way that you approach it and the way that I approach it is like, hey, here's the quote from chapter 3. Here's the quote from chapter 8. I'm having trouble reconciling how those two things can be true at the same time. Can you help me? And I'm not doing it so that they will fumble over their words. I'm hoping it's like a set, like I'm setting them up so that they can spike it. But even for you, like you've done a great job of basically kind of taking yourself out of the middle of the circumstance and allowing the person to elucidate their point fully. Now, you'll push back, but it doesn't feel like pushback. It feels like this just is a natural progression of the conversation, which people don't really understand how much of a skill that is, because, coming into an interview that I'm doing digitally, like I'm preparing my outline and my notes as if they're going to answer it like a robot would. Yeah. Like exactly how I asked it, no more, no less. And then, okay, if they answer just all of my questions right down the line, there's going to be some sort of narrative arc to this episode. But then like you mentioned, some of my best interviews that I've ever done is when there's no outline at all. Yeah. But then you do just kind of get better at this over time. Like, for me, like I can sit down right here with no notes in front of me because I kind of have an idea of what we're going to talk about and where we're going to go. But part of that's just having a feel, but then just having, so many of these under your belt to where it's just natural for you to do it.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. I mean, like I said, I approach really everything that way. And two things I will add, like even for speaking engagements, not that I do a ton of them anymore, but at the height of when the books were out, and, there was probably a 7 or 8 year period from 2013 to 2020 or so where I was doing a number of them. Even with that, I don't have prepared speeches, like teleprompter style, word for word. If somebody says, hey, we want you to speak for about an hour on subject X, I'll, whether it's in my phone or even on like a 3x5 note card. I mean, that's the gist of what I'll have. I'll have a handful of bullet points. Yep. That's just, I may say like, hey, I want to talk about this subject and then this subject, and have some kind of order that way. But I also am not going to speak about something that I can't do that with, I only, feel comfortable giving my opinion if I feel like it's warranted from having enough experience to have one that's at least valid enough for people to want to hear. And if that's not the case, I've certainly had guests on, because most of my guests are former military or they're law enforcement. There's a lot of commonalities that we have to where it's easy for me to kind of go back and forth with them and be able to do a lot of things off the cuff. If that doesn't exist, this is where I see, some people kind of get into trouble with not having anything to say, or just kind of like somebody will give a 2-minute, really well thought out, super deep answer to a question. They're like, yeah, it's great. So tell me about, and there's like no follow up. And so to me, the second part of it is if you are over your skis or you really are kind of, out of your depth in terms of whatever the subject is, have a childlike curiosity towards it and just ask more questions. The ones that pop right into your mind, the ones that, if they pop into your mind, even if they're a really simple or what some people may even consider a dumb question, that's probably what most people listening are having the same questions to. And to me, that's one of my favorite compliments is, I find myself, a question will pop into my head and you ask it almost right when it happens. Like to me, that's always my goal is for the people listening to get their questions answered and for them to listen and be, entertained and enjoy it.
Well, that's what a good host does is you anticipate the needs of your audience because, the audience can't get their time back, right? If they buy a product that you endorse and it's terrible, you can probably work a way, for them to get their money back or anything. But if somebody invests an hour in one of my solo episodes or Bible study episodes or 2 or 3 hours to an interview or something like that, I can't give them the time back. And so I think of my audience member as that amalgamation of a person. And if they were sitting here, if they have read the book that I read, if they were in the middle of the conversation like I was in the middle of, how would they respond? And the other thing that people don't quite understand is like reciprocity, proprietorship. And so that one of the things that I mean is I remember getting some pretty nasty comments after I went on your show because we started talking about God at one point, started talking about the church and all that. And you were doing your normal thing where you were seeking to understand a person's position and letting them fully elucidate it. Okay, great. When then it was all from Christians, by the way, Christians that were just furious with how I handled the situation on the Mic Drop podcast. And I was like, do tell, what do you mean situation? They're like, well, you should have said this. And when Mike said this should have been your response. Have you ever heard of Christian apologetics and blah, blah, blah? And I said, I understand your fervor and all that. So 2 things. Number 1, how about you build up a public profile such that you would get on the radar of someone like Mike Ritland to get on his show, get an invitation on his show, accept it, go onto the show. And then when he puts you in the same circumstance, you respond the way that you respond that you see fit. So there's one. The second is when somebody invites you into their home. So even if it's a studio that they have in a space they're renting or a space offsite, that's their home, right? They can kick off their shoes and go to the fridge with less awkwardness than you can. Okay. So you have to understand the situation that you're in. So like if I'm invited, because I have been invited over to dinner at houses where everyone in the house is a Muslim and only one of them speaks English. And if I go in there and start demanding that they do things in a Christian way and to pray to Yahweh and to pray in the name of Jesus, not the prophet, but the actual savior of the world, like all those things, I'm in their home, right? Now, there's an evangelism conversation that can be had, and there's a time and a place and an opportunity that you could, help be a conduit for the Holy Spirit to do its work, but you're in someone else's house. You have to understand, like, you don't want to get into an unnecessarily adversarial position when both of you are still in the posture of seeking to understand, if that makes sense.
For sure it does. And I'd take it a step further even in from a kind of a broad spectrum 30,000 foot view component of evangelism, if you want to use that as a broad term. To me, the adage of you catch more flies with honey than you do vinegar, I think couldn't be more apt when it comes to spreading a message of faith or frankly, anything. I mean, anything that somebody either doesn't understand or disagrees with, the harder you push and insult and compete and...
Yeah, especially insult.
Yeah, I mean, like that's not helping your case at all. It's doing actually the exact opposite. And I think that as somebody who grew up, a pretty staunch Lutheran, went through, the 3-year confirmation process, went to church very, very regularly my entire childhood, and even into the first couple of years in the Navy, found a church that I liked and kind of could feel comfortable in and identify with, if you want to call it that. First few years I was in the Navy, went very regularly when I was in town. And then spent decades being kind of having completely flipped the faith table upside down and walked completely away from it. And now having come full circle and gotten, kind of back into the way I grew up in a much different way, which I know we'll get into. But when I think about having seen both sides, I know for me and for most people that, again, either don't understand or even disagree with it, to me, the best way, if you're trying to evangelize, is to set such an example that it makes that other person question why you are the way that you are.
Yeah.
Like, don't tell me how good you are, how dedicated you are, how faithful you are. Show me in a way where, to me, it kind of reminds me of the way I think teachers, like, as a student, you shouldn't know what political side your teacher leans on if they're doing it right.
Right.
And to me, I view faith in very much that same way. I'm sure tons of people would disagree with that. That's my opinion, is that, from experience, and this is outside of just faith. This is anything that I either don't understand or disagree with, like arguing about it and telling me I'm wrong, and that, pounding on the desk and pointing out scripture and this is where you're wrong and this is how you can do better. Like that is not going to attract anyone. Like, you're not going to guilt somebody into coming on to your team, for lack of better terms. And so, to me, it's like that core component is really that fundamental principle that I kind of use with everything. And I wish that there was more of that, within the space of faith and kind of biblical studies and podcasts, that where I do see, a lot of times, whether it's guys like Charlie Kirk or I do think Wes Huff does a good job at kind of walking that line of being, incredibly thoroughly educated and getting a point across without being rude.
Yeah.
I think being kind and having that as kind of the lens with which you project all of your knowledge to the world, at least for me, is a far more effective mechanism for getting your message across. So I try to do that really with everything.
Well, the biblical mandate is to speak the truth in love, and people have trouble typically with one or the other. So they love the love part. The truth part seems a little persnickety. And so they're like, oh, I don't really want to do that. And then there's people that are like, well, truth. And there's absolutely no love in the message. And let's look at Charlie Kirk. So after he was assassinated, what I heard people saying about who Charlie was and how he acted did not comport at all or register at all with who he actually was on film, right? So let's look at something like, I don't know how many more societal issues can be more incendiary and more hot button than, transgenderism, okay? So here he's on a college campus. He has someone that comes up to the microphone. It's, obviously a male that thinks they're a female. So this is a guy, wearing a dress and makeup and all those different things. And the caricature that you got of Charlie Kirk is that he was going to start pointing and laughing, and everybody in a MAGA hat, hey, guys, go look at the weirdo, look at the guy in the dress, blah, 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 that type of thing. But isn't it so interesting? That's not how Charlie Kirk ever approached it. And so somebody would be presenting obviously as the opposite sex, and he would say things like, hey, if you don't mind me asking, are you transgender? Do you consider yourself to be transgender? Which is a very soft place to kind of ease in, because you're not assuming anything, even though you do have your own tacit assumptions. And then he would talk to the person in a way where he was seeking to understand the feeling behind the outward appearance, right? Mm-hmm. Because obviously this wasn't someone that woke up in their dorm room at the age of 20 and looked at their jeans and then looked at a dress and went, I think I'm going with the dress today. This is probably something that they've been wrestling with for a very, very long time, and it almost feels innate. Right. And then there are people that just get caught up in the cultural zeitgeist, and they get caught up in all that, and they're just highly gullible and can, easily be swayed. But he would talk to that person in such a loving way. And then he would always tell the truth. Look, you are not a female. You are a male. You were made in God's image, and God created them male and female. Okay. And he would have compassion for them, and he would ask for them to get help. And that's the problem with the speaking the truth and love part. Even if you just look at the church, there are a lot of churches that love the love part and they just stay in the love lane and leave truth out there, or only truth without love. But then when you actually look at the person who you purport to be the center of your religion, which is the person of Jesus Christ, and then you look in the scriptures as to how he acted around people, like to the woman caught in adultery, he didn't say, hey, it's no big deal that you're sinning and all that. I love you. No, he didn't say that. It was, yeah, go and sin no more. Like, I love you. You are a daughter made in the image of the King, but also stop doing that. Like, you're killing yourself. Yeah. And so I think that's the part that people really lose the thread on.
I agree. And again, to me, the overarching theme that I see, and again, I think that, my perspective is maybe a little different than somebody who's spent their entire life that way, is I've seen both sides of it. I've even felt and believed both sides of it, so this isn't something where I'm making assumptions on how things are received or what I think somebody is or how they're taking it in or whatever. And to me, the thing that I'm always reminded of, or I would say that I think about if I find myself getting into a judgmental state of mind is if we're all sinners, right? All of us are flawed human beings, and I am in no place to judge how anyone else lives their life, even if it's diametrically opposed to how I do it, and I disagree with every decision that they make. To me, I'm not going to overtly chastise them for what they're doing or saying what they're doing is wrong. I'm going to live my life in a way that I do my very best. Of course, I stumble regularly, but to exude, the principles that I adhere to and just try to set that example and be the change or that example that I want to see.
Hey guys, real quick. You've probably heard the phrase, ignorance is bliss, right? Well, some of you are ignorant about where the beef that you buy at the grocery store comes from and what it took to get to you. So that single package of grocery store ground beef can contain meat from over 100 different cows, sometimes from multiple countries. And if one of those cows was sick or mishandled in some way, it's mixed right into your dinner. So most people don't realize that some ground beef at the store isn't just beef either. It's scraps and trimmings chemically treated with ammonia to kill bacteria and then blended in to bulk up the weight of what you're buying. It's legal, it's cheap, and it's on the plates of Americans all over the country, usually without the customer ever knowing. So even if you buy what you think is a nice roast or steak, it's been passed from feedlot to processor to packaging plant, handled by people who will never eat it, and raised by farmers who will never see the end product. And in that journey, the cattle were likely fattened on hormone-packed feed, pumped full of antibiotics just to survive cramped feedlot conditions, and processed alongside meat from hundreds of other animals. And by the time it hits your grill, you don't know whose cow it was, what it was fed, or what's actually in it. I don't want you or your family eating low quality, jacked up beef. That's why I want you to use the official beef delivery partner of Undaunted.Life, Primal Beef. So Primal Beef is a cattle operation owned and operated by Sean Glass. He's a retired Navy SEAL that partnered with Jocko Willing to launch Primal Beef. So what makes Primal Beef different from other beef delivery companies? It's a combo of the following. All American Black Angus cattle, and the beef comes from one farm, and that's in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The beef is all natural, no hormones ever, no mRNA ever. And after slaughter, the entire carcass is dry aged, then hand cut by artisan butchers, and then flash frozen to ensure that it maintains tenderness, marbling, and flavor. And here's another cool thing. For every box sold, Primal Beef donates meat directly to a member of America's Special Operations Forces through the C4 Foundation. So you can take pride in knowing that your purchase will help put literal food on the table for America's finest warriors. If you're still on the fence, it's probably because you've been eating too much soy, drying your emo tears with your bangs, and you've forgotten what real food tastes like. Primal Beef can help with that. Try Primal Beef out today by going to primalbeef.com. That's primalbeef.com. Use the promo code Kyle to get $25 off your first order. Again, that's primalbeef.com. Promo code Kyle to get $25 off your first order.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because, talking about kind of full circle moments, because you said you kind of grew up in the Lutheran tradition. Like I didn't grow up in church at all. Started going on my own as a 15-year-old, First Baptist West in Lawton, Oklahoma, and we kind of had our different tracks. But when you mentioned the kind of like the, upending the tables part, like that's when you and I got to be buddies, was around that time period. And I think this may have been maybe your third appearance on the show. This was years ago when you were talking about one of your recent books and the God conversation came up, and you were like, you had gotten so frustrated at one point. You're like, Kyle, why the F do you care so much? Like if I believe in God or not. And I was just basically like, well, because I love you, Mike. And if I believe the stuff that I'm saying, then like, destination wise, like I would prefer your destination to be different. But I remember this distinctly. I'm driving back. This would have been, I was in Colorado Springs for a speaking engagement. So I got to spend some time with John Eldridge because he lives out there, and I had a speaking engagement. So I'm driving back to the massive Colorado Springs airport, getting ready to come back to Oklahoma, and phone's ringing and it's you. I think you had sent me a text, and this is completely out of the blue. We hadn't talked in a while, and you're just basically like, hey, what version of the Bible do you like to read the most? And I was like,
Who is this?
I'm sorry, like, because I've got several people on my phone where there's like 5 people with the same name, and I'm like, Ritland's kind of an interesting last name. Like, wait a minute, okay, yeah, I have previous text messages. This is from Mike, and I can't remember. I think I responded like, hey, if I could just have one, I would get the ESV Study Bible from Crossway or something like that. But then I said, hey, just hold off a second, like, let me get some stuff together, and so I ended up getting a Bible together and sending it to you and all that. But like, that was such an interesting text to get from you because of some of the conversations we had previously. And I didn't really pry. I didn't feel like it was necessary for me. But at one point I was like, hey, what are you exploring? Like, what are the thoughts? Are you reading this so that you can like, pound me harder the next time I come on the show or something like that? But I mean, that was a couple of years ago now. And so like, I'm just curious what was happening at that time where you even wanted to reach out, and I guess kind of where are we at now?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question and your response and the incredibly generous care package of study materials, Bible. What you sent me was super kind and very much appreciated. So I guess from kind of the start to finish, growing up the way that I did, first couple of years in the Navy, I was, again, if you want to call it religious, however you want to call it, living a life of faith. When I went on my first deployment, that's when really everything changed, is that I found myself, and granted, this is in my early 20s when this is happening. My brain isn't fully developed. I'm still, not a particularly wise young man, and just didn't have a lot of life experience. But I found myself, all over the world, experiencing cultures that were so vastly different from everything that I was used to, and in every way, not just culturally with, food or the way they dress or different language, religion, politics, the way they treat each other, the way they treat women, the way they treat everything. And that's when, doubt started to flood my mind more than I think it would normally. I think we all have doubts at certain points, but it became harder and harder for me to think or feel like the way that I had been raised was the right way, for 2 reasons. One, it was just looking at kind of from a mathematical standpoint. I was like, I'm in all these other places that are not predominantly Christian, who, there's guys my age that I'm fighting that their parents were Muslim. They've never really been exposed to Christianity, or if they have, it's been, shunned and considered the wrong thing. And, what makes me right or us right versus them. And then also, and I think the much broader kind of reason that instituted a lot of doubt was the amount of evil that I experienced, and seeing just how incredibly horribly people were treating each other in some of these places. And, and it made me really kind of question, if we're all God's children and he's omnipotent and all knowing and has the plan for the entire scope of the planet, why would you do this? Or even if you say, well, it's free will, why would you even allow that? Yep. Not that God is saying, I'm going to have this guy do this horrible thing, whether it's Satan's influence or mankind's, inherent bad nature, stemming from the Garden of Eden, who knows? But the fact is that it was impossible for me to reconcile the fact that this is allowed to happen. For a lot of people, I think when they become a parent, it brings them back into faith. Whether it's a circle of life, a creation of life, there's a reset button for, I think, most people. For me, it actually did the opposite thing. Similarly, I've got multiple kids, as do you. And if one of my children had a 2x4 with nails sticking out of it, getting ready to hit the other one, there's no way I'm letting that happen.
That's right.
And so for me, it kind of further cemented that, why would you do this, type of thing. And so at that same, or I guess not at that same time, I didn't start the show until my kids were a little older. But over the span of the 8 years of the show, and this is, kind of going back to the why, which I think is really important and I don't think is an accident, is that, over the course of that 8 years, there's been a number of guests that I've had on that I'm sure you can relate to this, is that the second they walk in the room, you can tell there's something different about them.
Yep.
There's an energy, a presence, the way they carry themselves, a vibration to them, whatever you want to call it. There's something that is palpable and really difficult to describe, but that's different. And I don't know what it is, but I like it, and not in any way really other than like it feels comforting to be in their presence, which is rare for me. I'm not saying I don't like most people, but I do find that I don't relate to most people. I don't have much in common with most of the people that I meet day to day, and don't find myself wanting to spend time with them. In every one of these cases, every single one of these guys were guys that I was thinking to myself, like, they're competent, they're confident, they're capable, they're calm, they're kind. And if an apocalyptic scenario came about, that's one of the guys I would want in my tribe. That's one of the few guys I would want to hang out with and look to for leadership, resource, etc. In every single case, without exception. And I would put you in that category as well, as one of those guests. In every single case, every one of those guys lived their entire life looking through the lens of their faith. Their faith drove every decision they made, every conversation they had, every professional decision, personal decision. Every single thing about them was, well, what does the Bible say? What should I do? Let me pray about it. And it was a very slow burn for me. It wasn't like there was a couple guys and this light switch came on. It was noticing it over and over and over and over. And it got to the point where there was an almost light switch moment of me just realizing, like, that is the common denominator. It took a long time for me, embarrassingly, for me to make that pattern connection. But I started to realize, I don't think it's an accident that I'm doing this show, and every single guy that's had this impact on me has been a man of incredible faith and very, dedicated in their lives to their faith. And there's something to it. That there's a reason why it's happening. It makes me want to be more curious and get back to a point where I want to learn more, and I want to get back into and have a relationship with God and pray often and learn more. For me, I've always been a big fan of history, and for me, that, like, where I'm at in my life now, just being almost 50, what I find the most fascinating and probably find myself doing the most is kind of the almost rabbit hole research of the historical context that is the scope of the entire Christian experience. And for me, that it's been life-changing to, read a lot of different, denominations, Bibles, or, watching interviews with guys like Wes Huff, or, just really anything I can get my hands on, literature or video-wise, that gives me a broader understanding of the Christian experience, has been something I've become very, very fascinated in. And then fast forward to, between when I sent you that message and kind of as we sit today, Charlie Kirk was killed. Now, if you had told me or asked me, what kind of impact do you think it would have on you if Charlie Kirk was shot at an event, I'd have said, well, that, it'd be unfortunate, but people die every day. And, I wouldn't have put much thought into it. There was something about, when he was killed that I would say rattled my psyche far more than I would have ever expected. Not that I was this huge fan of his. I'd listened to a few of his events, didn't really follow his work otherwise. But I was doing a show that day, and the guest I had on, was a former Ranger, spent decades as an undercover narcotics guy, spent his entire adult life combating evil. And when we took our first break, as you can and relate to, the podcast episode is one of the very few times where you're actually sheltered from everything. It's kind of like being on a flight with no Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
It's really the only time in our lives where your phone isn't going off and there isn't stuff on the news, the radio, or whatever. And so when we took our first break, it was right after it happened. And so we didn't know anything, like didn't know that he was dead, didn't know any circumstances. It was just Charlie Kirk's been shot in an event. Another couple hours goes by, and now we find out, and the video's out, and there was this very strange but powerful, unspoken just gravity, where he and I just kind of looked at each other, didn't say anything, didn't need to say anything, but there was just something about that moment that was really heavy, and I couldn't really explain it. Throughout the rest of that week, I found myself thinking about it in a lot of different ways, and it just had this really enormous impact on me. And by Friday, I was like, I have to go to church this weekend. Like I have to. I don't know. I can't explain it. It's the Holy Spirit saying, go.
Yeah.
But that's what happened. And so I went, I found just the most local church. I didn't do a ton of research as to which one to go to or whatever. I went to, I think it was almost the closest one to my house. And the second I walked in, the song Ocean, they were playing Oceans,
yeah,
which I had never heard. But between the, kind of passively listening to the lyrics and just the energy and just everything that was going on in the church, like I was completely overwhelmed with emotion, broke down. Like I was just a sobbing mess, for most of it. And, for me, it was just a very life-changing, powerful moment that it's hard to explain it. I know you know exactly what I'm talking about, but for those who have never experienced it, you can't really explain it. No. And ever since then, it's just been, something that's been at the front of my mind, starting the day with prayer, ending the day with prayer, reading, a lot of different, I don't even know what the word to use would be. I mean, not necessarily like 365-day devotional things, but just different, this topic, read this, and this topic, read that, while at the same time also going really heavy into it kind of from a historical reference standpoint of being really fascinated and interested by, even prior to Jesus being born, his life, subsequently, the different pathways that different denominations took, why they took them. And that's been, again, just for me, I'm always a student. I always want to learn. And that's something that I really knew nothing about, as much time as I spent studying the Lutheran denomination of Christianity as a child and as a young man. I really had no idea what I was studying or really even believing in, and no backdrop to it. And surprisingly, Doron Kedar, who came on the show, I don't know if you watched that episode or not. It was a long one. It was like a 6.5-hour show. Having him kind of walk through from the Israeli Jewish perspective of the history of religion, the three main religions, yep, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, from its inception, basically, and walking through from, Abraham to today, and weaving kind of that entire chronological timeline in. There were so many things that I had no idea what he was talking about. And that was another conversation that really piqued my interest for having a better understanding of why the church exists, why these denominations exist, where did Islam come from, why did Christians depart from Judaism, how does it all fit together? And so I've spent a ton of time just kind of really trying to have a better understanding of that, because I A, find it so fascinating, and B, I think my personality of, to believe in something, like I want to know as much about it as possible and take the blinders off and not be so microscopic. And to me, strangely, it kind of reminds me of jiu-jitsu. It's like, I think a lot of people in faith focus on the technique, it's this passage, it's, and not look at the overall strategy of what you're trying to accomplish, generally speaking.
Well, and we'll get into jiu-jitsu, but like you're using a particular technique regardless of the person that is opposite of you. And so it's like you're using biblical principles of morality, because there's some rules that are explicitly laid out. Don't do this, okay? And then there's other stuff where it's more implicit, like, okay, this is what a moral, godly person would do. This is what they would avoid doing. And so there's a little bit more play there. But even going back to the Charlie Kirk thing, and I wrote down a couple, I'm going to send you home with some more books that I have on the shelves of the library, because Titus Kennedy is a great guy. He's a biblical archaeologist. I got several of his books here. He's been on the show a couple of times. And I think he just released a book last year. I haven't picked it up yet, but here's all the stuff that archaeologists never expected to find that prove that this part of the Old Testament was real. Because, you get people that are like, you can't believe in the Bible because it says this people group was in this part of the world and there's no evidence that those people live there. Oops, there's an archaeological dig. It's like, well, crap, those people were actually there. Yeah. And so it's some of those types of things. But going back to the Charlie Kirk thing, I think everybody understands exactly what was happening with you, because I just got off a plane and turned my phone on and buzz. Charlie's been shot. We don't know, blah, blah, blah. Then a buddy sent me a link to the video, which I can't unsee. Yeah. And
you know immediately what happened.
Yeah, that is not a wound that, is survivable. But then there was a report that he had been stabilized at the hospital. Again, it's the craziness of Twitter and the aftermath of something that just happened. And here I am on the ground in Jacksonville, going to Church 1122, Saturated. It's their big thing every year where it's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and it's, tons of people, great worship and great speakers and preachers and all that. And it's just hanging in the air. And you're right. I mean, there were people that had somewhere between never heard of Charlie Kirk to had listened to everything he said, or somewhere in between, that all were deeply impacted by what his death meant, not that it happened. And what he was seemingly killed for, right? Which was the sake of Christ and the sake of truth. And it was so heavy. Like Joby and I, even had to record like a special episode because he was getting hit up by a bunch of people. I was getting hit up by a bunch of people. It's like, hey, we're in the same town for once. Like, let's sit down and like kind of talk through this. But sociologists have speculated that the Sunday after Charlie Kirk was murdered, because he was murdered on a Wednesday, the Sunday after was the most highly attended Sunday church in the history of the planet. Yeah. So more people attended church at some form of a Christian church on that Sunday than at any other time in human history. And then you go to Charlie Kirk's memorial services, and you could call it a memorial service, or you could just flat out call it what it was, which was a worship service. So you have worship music being played, and you had, people from Trump's cabinet and tens of thousands of people in there, praising with their hands up and in the prayer. You have Erica get up there and forgive her husband's assassin. And you had all these things kind of happening. And it's coalescing with an absolute explosion in Gen Z, especially young men, in their church attendance. Bible sales across the globe have exploded even before, and certainly since Charlie Kirk's assassination. And so typically you can't know that you're experiencing a revival when you're in it. So you may have been familiar, as a couple of years back now, there was something, Asbury University, they had the Asbury Revival. And so it was like they were just doing a normal worship service, and then 3 or 4 days later, they're still going. Like maybe the Spirit of God fell, maybe it was just an artificially long, worship service, who knows. But there's so many instances of people having profound encounters with God when they weren't expecting. So like you walking into church and feeling like you completely overwhelmed with emotion, that's the separation, Mike, for somebody that uses their brain, their logical capacities to surmise knowledge and to understand what to do with that information so that it can be directed at whatever action they need to do, and somebody that has a profound encounter with the Holy Spirit. Because even going back to what we were talking about earlier, Mike, with people that argue and they're punching the blah, 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 these are people that are apparently not reading the words, because if you read these words, it shows you can't argue someone into the kingdom of God. You can't even convince them, right? We can't even be convinced or prove that you and I are even here right now and this isn't a simulation of some kind, right? But you can be a conduit through which the Spirit speaks to somebody. Like I talked about at Easter, this Easter service that I just went to. There was something in the air, Mike. I had walked in that church hundreds of times in my life, but on Easter morning, something was just different. And my oldest son was in service with us for the first time, and they start singing How Great Thou Art, and he just reaches up and grabs my hand and starts holding my hand. I'm like, what is that? It's like, wow. I felt like I got to experience a slice of heaven. Yeah. And I couldn't even sing because with every word, I felt like I was choking on the word because I was choking on what the words meant. Because there are beautiful songs and beautiful melodies that are talking about nothing.
Yeah.
Right. But you experienced something so profound, but it's interesting. And I want you to kind of talk about this more. There are some people, Mike, and you probably experienced this. They have that mountaintop experience or that church camp high, or they go into that worship service and they break down in tears and all that. And then the rest of their life comes, the dryer stops working, their truck, they get a flat, or, they get hurt at jiu-jitsu, and then they're just kind of back into their normal routine. And so they either think that was just a flare up. I don't know what that was. Maybe it was indigestion that, made its way to my tear ducts or something like that. Or they start chasing that feeling, right? Kind of like a crackhead. They're just trying to find that high again. And it seems like you've very soberly approached your life after that occurrence, which happened in September of last year. So talk to me a little bit more about that, because again, the tendency for some people is to chase that feeling because it'll substantiate something in their brains.
Yeah, I love the question and how you framed it. And there's two things really. One is that, and this isn't to diminish anybody else's experience that's similar to that. For me, it was just that powerful.
Yeah.
Like it really and mostly is that simple, is that I had not had that feeling ever in my life. I'd never felt it before. And so I think between the power and the profound nature with which I experienced that emotion, it had a permanent impact on how I approach really everything. The second thing, and I would say, I don't know that I'd put a percentage on this was, level of power or whatever, but the other very profound thing that also took place were both of my kids did the same thing without us talking about it.
They went to church.
Yeah. And so my oldest, she has spent more time, I would say, in her relationship with God over the years, and has had friends that she's gone to church with. And, she moved out of the continental United States for a couple of years and found a church where she was at, and has kind of been more into it, for lack of better terms. My youngest, I think probably heavily influenced from me, just never really thought much about it. Her entire childhood, we did baptize both of them at my parents' church right after they were born, mostly out of tradition.
Yeah.
Which I hate to say that that's the case. That's the reality, just being transparent. I'm glad that we did. I would love to do it again, or have them decide to do it again. But is that, they went through the same thing, and especially for my youngest to experience kind of the same exact path that I did. And she hadn't mentioned anything. It wasn't until Sunday night they FaceTimed me together, and they live out of the city. They live in state, but they go to school elsewhere. And so they both got on the phone and FaceTimed me and told me that had happened. Basically said the exact same week that you just had, we had, without us ever saying that. And I was just, again, I was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
So, for me, those two things, I think, and also I would say, like, seeing their maybe appreciation, or how much it felt like they valued that connection, to their dad that way that we just had never had before. All those things combined, like, to me, it's not even an option, really. It's like, this is just how it is, in terms of me wanting to learn more, experience more, study more, and just try to gain as much knowledge, information, and spiritual guidance as I can, So it's been a really powerful 7 or 8 months, that's for sure. But I'm just so thankful for the things that have happened and led to getting me to arrive to where I'm sitting across the table from you to talk about it.
And so I'm even curious for, even going back to when you text me about the Bible and those types of things. Like, take me back to that time period, because that was before Charlie Kirk was assassinated. So obviously that was kind of a continuation. What even got you to that point, to where that was even something that you would even consider doing, and why in the world did you text a angry ginger podcaster?
Well, that has a lot to do with it.
That's right.
I do love angry gingers.
That's right. Let's go. You're one of the few. You're one of the few people.
My youngest is, I wouldn't call her angry, but she's for sure a ginger, so I can
relate. She's got to rely on SPF 100 to make it through the day. Yeah, gotcha.
So, I mean, going back to the podcast, that's really the gist of it, is that, not just because maybe I kind of underplayed the caliber of men that I'm talking about, is that obviously the presence piece that I talked about was significant, but when I looked at what they'd been through, what they'd done with their lives, whether they had just unbelievably brutal childhoods followed by 20 years of hardened combat experience, and just all of the things that they had accomplished and done, and like that all combined, and just seeing it over and over and over and over, these men that were just so incredibly impactful in how they came across, how they carried themselves. And I also think that, strangely, the decades that I've spent training dogs is, it makes you focus on nonverbal communication and body language far more than most people. I mean, human beings are perceptive in that way. Nothing compared to dogs.
Off the charts, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the, not to get too far off the rails, but I do think it's an important concept to bring up, is if you think about, like, let's say you're sitting in a Target parking lot in your car, there's a man you've never met walking out of Target 100 yards away, and he's having the worst day of his life. Are you going to be able to tell that by how he walks out of Target?
You're going to get some hints for sure.
So now think about the amount of information that you and I have exchanged since we've been sitting here. How much has body language, nonverbal communication played a role in any of that?
It certainly played a role, but most of it's been verbal.
Most of it's verbal.
Yeah.
Human beings are overwhelmingly verbal. Yes, there are cues, there are things that we pick up on. Now put yourself in a dog's shoes. Where they don't speak at all. Yes, they whine, they bark, they growl, but 99% of their communication is all nonverbal. Spending decades doing that, especially when it's getting in a bite suit and having to test a dog, and now the responsibility of a fellow teammate, a police officer, somebody who's going to put the dog's responsibility is going to be, on their shoulders, and vice versa, is that they're going to have to trust this dog with their life. So you better believe I'm going to take the selection and evaluation incredibly serious. And I'm going to put everything I can into that dog to get in his head, to intimidate him, to whatever. Doing that for decades, you get very, very good at doing certain things to elicit responses, but also being able to read them. And so, at the risk of sounding like I'm blowing my own horn, I think that I have a better ability than most to read people and their energies and their presences. I think more than most people, just because I've spent so much time doing it. And what I kept finding myself doing is just noticing so many little things about these people, about how they carried themselves and the way they said things, and just their perspective on things. And it just kept happening over and over and over. And I think it was a combination of the episode I did with Doron, and then also a Delta Force guy, Jeff, that had written a book that I don't know if you've heard of it or read it. I forget the name of it. I'll get it to you. But both of those guys having very different perspectives, but having incredible depths of knowledge as it relates to the historical timeline of the three major faiths over the last 2,500 years. And that's kind of where that came from, is that, I'm seeing this pattern. It's not an accident. I need to know more. I want to know more. The reason I sent you a message and nobody else, I didn't send that message to anyone else. I didn't take a poll of who thought.
I was wondering. I wonder what they all voted on. That was my guess. Yeah.
No, you're the only guy I asked, and it's just because I put you into the same category as those guys for somebody who lives their life that way, and also knowing that kind of your day to day is pretty heavily centered around, speaking with people like that, having round tables with people. You have, real high level, strong relationships with some of the best and most well-known pastors all over the country and probably even the world. And I, in flipping through kind of my mental Rolodex of who's going to have the probably the best perspective, having seen so many different things within, Christianity as a whole, your opinion of what type of, or what version of the Bible is the best to look into is what I wanted to know. And because I think on the microcosm of Christianity, I think that's important is knowing which translation is going to be the most accurate. And I also tend to look at Christianity as a faith kind of in that same way, in that, which, if you're looking at denominations or aspects of Christianity, and I always try to not get too far in the weeds on this is wrong versus this is right and this is accurate versus this is not. That is something I would love to get further into, but is that, trying to take a version of the Bible and a sect or denomination of Christianity that's the least changed as possible.
Right.
Obviously it's going to be an assumption for anybody living in today's day and age, which one of those is the most accurate. And that's where archaeological, findings and a lot of things are going to come into play. But to me, it's kind of the macrocosm is that, the microcosm is, which version of the Bible. And you seemed like the guy to ask for that.
Well, I mean, that's humbling, and I'm glad I didn't. I could have told you to read the Message Bible, which is technically not even a translation, but that would have been fun to get a text message back. Kyle, what is this nonsense? But what I told you was the English Standard Version, because when you get into the different types of Bibles, there's the word for word translations. Some are readable, some are not super readable. Then you have kind of thought for thought translations. That puts a little bit too much wiggle in the joint for some passages. And some people start to take liberties. They'll make gendered language not gendered. And it's just like, guys, come on, time out. And then obviously you have people that are like, well, you're technically not reading the Bible unless you're reading it in the Hebrew as written down in, or the Greek that it was written down in, or the ancient Galilean Aramaic in which Jesus spoke, or something like that. But what they're describing is actually Islam, because if you're a true dyed-in-the-wool Muslim, you cannot read the Quran unless it's in Arabic, right? So if you're reading it in English or Spanish or German or Portuguese or something like that, you're not reading the Quran. So I'm like, what? It's kind of something that happens in society. We treat Christianity like it's Islam, and then we treat Islam like it's Christianity. And it's like, bad news bears. That's not good. Let's not do that. But the whole point is like, it's like, what's the best Bible? The one you'll read. That's the best one. Yeah. So if you read,
version.
Yeah, it's like if you, but that's what my boys have, right? Yeah. We have the Action Bible,
I've seen that, actually,
and we've got the Action Bible for very little kids, and we've got the Action Bible for a little bit older kids. Because if I bust out the King James on the boys, the these and thous are going to leave them in the dust, right? Yeah. And so for a lot of people, it's the same thing when people are trying to get in shape. They spend all this time researching the best shoes to run in, what time of day the endorphins will be released by this amount of effort and all that. But what they never do is just go work out. And so it's like the best version of the Bible to read is the one that you'll read. But I typically do ESV because it's a word-for-word translation that is supremely readable. There are some places, especially in the Old Testament, that can get a little stodgy, a little stale. But this isn't about entertaining you. It's about trying to accurately portray from the original writers that were, that this message is God-breathed and it's for us. It wasn't written, about us, but it is for us and for our overall betterment and sanctification. But even just curious for you, I've talked to a lot of people, Mike, over the years, and I've seen a lot of people just kind of in the cultural or podcast sphere that are Christian curious, or they're Christ curious. Or, they'll see someone who is, for all intents and purposes, as far as we know, a secularist, like a Jordan Peterson. They'll see Jordan Peterson, this guy with this super high octane, high IQ brain, and he just talks about the Bible with such reverence. And he just talks about how this refers to this, and they're like, this Bible, he's like, this isn't a book as much as it's a library, and it's hyperlinked. Like, this refers to that, which refers to these 7 things, which refers back to that. And so there are plenty of people that are curious. There are plenty of people that know stuff about this Middle Eastern Jewish construction worker that was also an itinerant rabbi that, had a 3-year public ministry in his early 30s and was killed for his troubles. They know stuff about him, but they don't know him? And I know that can kind of seem kind of ethereal and emotional, but it's like, no, do you know him in here? And have you placed your faith in his finished work on the cross, that somehow, some way that counted for you? And so even in, whether you want to go back to your early life with Lutheranism and things like that, but even in your last 7-8 months of this spiritual awakening, the person and work of Christ as it pertains to Mike Ritland, where are you at with that?
I guess it's hard to frame or explain kind of where I'm at with it, other than just saying, for me, like I feel through my entire soul and all the way through my heart his presence for the first time in my life. No two ways about it. And for me, the stress relief, not that I was a stressed out person. It's one thing that I have been very thankful and fortunate and grateful for. If I look at the transition out of the military and the struggle that most veterans experience, I think, in losing that as an identity and finding the 2.0 version of themselves and being depressed and, turning to certain substances or whatever. I never had that. I whether it's some of the psilocybin or ibogaine treatments that have saved a lot of our veterans' lives, I've never felt, any need or being called to do that. I never felt like I was in a place where it was a negative or I was down or depressed. Even with that, this resurgence and coming back to Christ in a way where, the presence of him in my flesh is undeniable, still presented a feeling of relief unlike anything I'd ever felt also, so to me, I think it's natural a lot of times when people are at the very bottom, they're searching for anything to get them out of the bottom, and they find that, and that's great. For me, that's from my perspective, kind of the one of the most beautiful things of the entire process is I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't in a position where I was grasping at anything that I could find as a spiritual life raft to get out of this horrible situation that I was in. It just happened. Which to me, not to take anything away from anybody's experience who it saved their life because they were in whatever position that was just incredibly terrible. But I think that's, the primary reason why it's had such a profound impact on me is I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't in this place where I felt like I needed a hand up or anything. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but, it's something, it's a feeling I've never felt before. It's been present, for months now. And I'm just overwhelmed with, joy as it relates to the feeling that I get from the peace that it brings.
One, what you bring up is an important topic that I've talked about with a lot of different guys, which is some people feel like their story of faith isn't cool enough to share. And so, because it's always the dramatic story, the drug addict that still had the belt tied around their arm with the needle hanging out, and then they have this out-of-body experience, and Jesus says, hey, stop being such an idiot, like I died for you, wham, and they slap them, then boom, they come back into their body. Makes a great book, man. It makes a great speech. It makes a great, mini series or something like that. Some people don't have that experience. Some people realize at the age of 6 years old that Jesus was a real man that died on a real cross for a real sin debt, and he paid for the sins past, present, and future of all of humanity, and that we can put our faith in his finished work. No heroin, no out-of-body experience, just a little kid and the childlike faith that comes with it. And, you're even talking about the curiosity of a child, almost is how you approach the podcast. And so your story is just your story. Some stories are made for television. Some are just made to be shared in a dyadic, communication over coffee or something like that. And so, but ultimately what I always try to get to with people is trying to figure out, okay, how can I best help them if they're on a sanctification journey or if they're on an evangelism journey? Because sanctification means you're already a believer and you're basically a baby deer. And what can I do to help you to where you can walk better, get stronger, and become more sanctified? And then for other people, it's because the thing where'd you grow up? Ohio?
Iowa.
Iowa. That's right. And so here in Oklahoma, I call it country music theology. And I've talked to, people in Texas where you live now. And one of the hardest things to do in ministry is to convince someone that thinks they're a Christian that they're not. And because I know a lot of people that, they were baptized when they were a kid, they believe in God, whatever that means, their grandmama and grandpappy were really good Christians. And, when they vote Republican. And if they listen to music, it's 90s country, and God likes all that stuff. And so, we check the boxes, wrap it in an American flag, and boom, you're a Christian. And then trying to convince someone that they're still a depraved sinner that is doing Christian things, even going to church. But one of the most haunting scriptures is where, God says to these people that said, wait, we cast out demons in your name. We did all this ministry in your name. And he says, depart from me, for I never knew you. These were people that were just doing what was culturally acceptable at the time, which was going to church, doing an Easter, get together, similar to what you witnessed when you were in these Muslim countries. You witnessed people that were just operating to the beats of how Islam worked into their everyday life. And so that's the thing I tried to nail down for people is like, even with where you sit right now, it seems like the presence of God is all over the place. Like you keep using the word presence, and I wrote it down, like presence. Do you, like, from your understanding of theology, do you feel like that's an indwelling of the Holy Spirit, which is what Christians are given whenever they accept Christ? Because there's not like a magical prayer you can pray. It's not anywhere in the Bible. There's not like you have to have this down at the altar moment, but there's just this realization like, no, I believe this. And in that moment, you receive the Holy Spirit and your sanctification journey begins. Or would you say you're still just kind of like in this place of experiencing tremendous amounts of peace that kind of centers in and around your overall curiosity?
To me, I mean, at the risk of sounding maybe even contradictory, it's both.
Okay.
Without question, the feeling of the Holy Spirit, which is the only thing that I can kind of,
the only words you can think.
It's the only thing I can kind of mentally reconcile that it could be, because of it's just nothing I've ever experienced. And the context around with which it was experienced makes it impossible for me to deny that it's anything else. At the same time, there's this resurgence of this childlike curiosity. I think a large part of it is just that's my personality, is that when I find something interesting that I don't know anything about, I dive headfirst into it.
Yeah.
With this, again, that the kind of the humbling aspect of it for me is having spent, the confirmation process in the Lutheran Church is significant. It's thorough, but it's 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, and so that's not mental bandwidth wise the best time to learn things that have the gravity associated with them that I think, faith does in some ways. In some ways it's a great time to learn, but I think for me, at least, the overall scope of what I would call, I feel like I have an understanding, just was not there.
Yeah.
And to me, the beauty of it is that learning curve and process never ends. You'll hear me make probably more than this next jiu-jitsu reference. I'm sure I'll make more of them, but you can relate better than most. Is there's a lot of parallels that I see between them, and I hope that doesn't come off as sacrilege, but
not to this crowd. No.
But to me, it reminds me a lot of the jiu-jitsu journey, in that at first, and for some people it's maybe only a few months, for most people it's a few years, you feel lost. Every time you roll, unless it's with somebody as bad as you or worse, and even then you're both lost.
Yeah, that's right.
But there comes a point somewhere in your jiu-jitsu journey, if you do it long enough, where it just feels like, I get it. Even if whoever I'm training with is so much better than me that I can't keep them from doing what they want to do, and I can't accomplish any of my goals, I know what he's trying to do, and I know what I'm trying to do,
right.
And I just can't make that happen. But there's never I have no idea what I'm doing right now, or I have no idea what I should be trying to be doing right now. And to me, I don't feel like I'm at that point, Christian faith journey wise yet, where it's like, yeah, I get it. But if I was to compare myself sitting here right now to myself 1 year ago, there's no comparison. Just the level of understanding that I think or feel like I have for the kind of the macrocosm that is Christianity and even just faith, generally speaking, it just makes a lot more sense to me now. I don't want to say that I get it because I don't know that you ever completely do,
No.
but it's been a huge learning curve and one that I've just really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, and I don't think you'll ever arrive. Like, that's implicit in what sanctification is. It is a journey. But the reality is, and the truth of the gospel is that there is a sin debt that you cannot be in the presence of a holy and just God, and sin can't be there in his presence. And we were all born into sin. When Adam sinned, like, he is our federal head, and when he sinned, we were all born into it. You don't have to teach a baby to be selfish. You don't have to teach, people to sin. It's just part of our nature. And so there is a sin debt that we can't possibly be righteous enough or good enough or check enough boxes or do enough good deeds to live up to the standard of perfection. And so God, part of the Godhead, sent himself down in the form of Jesus to be the propitiation, the payment that satisfies the sacrifice on our behalf. And then you start getting into different theological languages, and I'm always going to make somebody mad with how I word it. But at some point, you make a decision that you're going to transfer your faith from yourself for your own future and your salvation onto Christ, and that we are going to be imputed with his righteousness. We receive his righteousness, and then our role from here on out is to share that same truth with someone else, with other people, and to live that out and to try to live a godly life as much as possible. So would you say that you personally are a Christian now, that you have put your faith in Christ for your sin debt, or are you still kind of just in the evaluation period? Because, part of it is because I want to know how I can best serve you and help you as a brother, aside from just leaving, sending you out here with 15 books from the library, which I'm about to do. But have you made that decision, or has that realization happened in you that no, regardless of how I was baptized, regardless of what version of the Bible I'm reading, I have transferred my faith from myself onto Jesus?
Without question, yes.
Mike, you don't know how freaking happy that makes me to hear, because I go back to those previous conversations and I just my heart hurt for some of the answers I got. You know what I mean? And the conversations I've had with people about you that have asked me about you, and they're like, where's Mike at? Where's Mike at? And I'm like, Mike's where Mike's at. And it's that's not up to me.
Yeah.
And I can't, it sucks because I'm an arguer, right? I'm a logic person. I want to put together these arguments, but it's you can't argue someone into the faith. You can just pray for them. And then you get a text message one day to where it's what? Out of nowhere. And I mean, did you ever think that this day would come where you would basically be making that declaration?
No, I don't. I mean, again, the kind of wind being let out of my faith sails as a young man, I thought was permanent. To be fair, I didn't think much about it. It wasn't something where I was like, well, this is gone. I wonder if I'm ever going to get it back. It just was something I just kind of stopped thinking about, and
it was almost like you felt like you had matured past it. Something.
Yeah, it was. I think the human nature of being arrogant, in your own mind, of thinking that you know better or that you have it figured out. I think I was consumed with that, of not thinking that I'm some genius. It's just, we're at this point, human civilization wise, where there's so many things that we can scientifically prove or whatever, that even that, it's look at what was scientifically proven 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100, 1,000 years ago, and it's laughable now. And, to think that it's not going to be the case 500 years from now, I think is equally laughable.
Yeah.
But I think, just, getting to that age of reason, and because I had grown up with it, I think for some people, or for at least me, I do think it maybe cheapened the experience because it wasn't a choice. It was something that was just part of my childhood, and I wouldn't trade that. I'm still thankful and glad that my parents raised me the way that they did. There's nothing about my childhood I would change. But I think for everybody's journey is their own. It's individual, and how and why it happens. There's only one entity that that has any skin in that game, and we're not the person that has that or whatever. So, for me, Yeah, it was just something where it was a natural progression of getting into, an age and accomplishing a lot of things militarily and professionally at a very young age, and getting to a point where I just kind of felt like I knew better, unfortunately, and had a lot of reasons that I found myself thinking or looking to not subscribe to or be faithful, and just looking at it, I think, from a very selfish standpoint, and that I knew better and it doesn't make any sense, and I'm not even going to try to figure it out. And so to your question, it's kind of a long tail on that kite, but no, I would have never would have expected the last few years to have gone the way that they've gone in that regard.
Well, so what are you looking forward to perspective wise? Because I forget exactly who said it, but they said, and this applies to a lot of areas, they're like, it's not how many years you've been a Christian, it's how many hours. And I try to tell people the same thing with jiu-jitsu. It's not how many years you've been doing jiu-jitsu, it's how many hours. Because there are guys right now that I've trained more years than they have, but they've already trained more hours than I will train in totality over the entirety of my jiu-jitsu life, right? Yeah. The same applies for Christianity. But like, you've got the establishment of who you've been up to this point. You've got being a Navy SEAL, serving in the military. You've got all the dog training. You've got the Warrior Dog Foundation. You've got, your team dog businesses. You've got the podcast. You've already got all this stuff. But now, depending on your perspective, laid over the top of all of it or undergirding all of it as a foundation or a scaffolding is this faith in Christ. And so how does that, what does that lead to on into the future? Are there things that you're kind of looking forward to? Because, one thing that I'll see from some people, they'll have this radical encounter with God, and then all of a sudden they feel like they have to burn every bridge and ship like in the vicinity, and they got to get a job with a card with a logo of a church on it and the word pastor on it, or they got to, go back to school to get a Bible degree or something like that. And maybe that is what God's calling them to do, but more than likely God wants them to be salt and light where they already exist. Like to be the hands and feet and of God, but in the areas of the world that they're already like having an influence and an impact. And so what is your faith in Christ going to lead to in all those other areas of your life?
To me, that's the, the beauty of, if you want to say arriving to this place that I've gotten to here recently is that I don't have to worry about it. Is that I don't think that far ahead anymore. And one of the things that I think is a byproduct of being an entrepreneur is there's this weird dichotomy of learning how to plan the next 20 minutes, 20 hours, 20 days, 20 weeks, 20 months, and 20 years. And you become a master planner and predictor and trying to move all these chess pieces to make the long game happen while still focusing on the short game. And while that didn't stress me out compared to stress in combat or, struggle with addiction or any of those types of things, it's still a very stressful thing. And I think that that's one of the bigger points of relief for me in coming to Christ recently is any time I find myself in that frame of mind of thinking, well, what's next? How do I take advantage of this? Where is this going to go? I don't worry about it. I look upstairs. And one thing I've found myself praying a lot often is just use me how you see fit, and I'm along for the ride. Like I'm not worried about it.
Just laying your yes down on the table.
Yeah, like I'll keep continuing to do what I do, and you use me as your tool, however you see fit. If that's in these few little areas, fantastic. If it's a complete transformative shift in every aspect of my life, fantastic. You're calling the shots. I'm not worried about it. And so to me, like that's been such a huge relief, is just to turn over that authority and submit that plan making and the always trying to angle for going down this path or that path. Is that, you're the map maker. I'm just the journeyman, so I'm open.
Well, there's a tremendous beauty in just laying your yes down, letting your yes be yes. But then also, so I can remember in that closet downstairs, those early episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. I remember sitting there going, no one's ever going to hear these episodes. Like, I'm going to give full effort, but no one's ever going to hear it. I'm not going to ever going to have more than a few dozen listeners outside of my own household. But it was like, God, may the words that I say glorify you, and I'm going to work as unto you. I'm going to work as unto the Lord. Now, thank goodness I actually did that, because now you got people discovering me with episode 902, and then they're going back to episode 1. Like, I wonder what this guy sounded like back then. And I'm like, oh God, thank God I like actually put effort into it. I don't agree with that guy all the time from, 8-9 years ago, but I can still stand by the work that I did. But one of my favorite things that I've ever heard in a sermon was a pastor out of New York named John Tyson. When he was like 16 years old, he worked in a butcher shop in Australia, grew up in Australia. And this was after he'd become a Christian. And here he is, he's got this side of beef that he's about to break down, for the butcher shop for the day. And he would lay out all of his tools, and he would just open his hands, and he would say, God, if no one else sees the cuts that I make today, you will see them. And may they be the best cuts that I am capable of, and that I can glorify you with these cuts. Amen. Right? Bro, if you approach everything in your life like that, God, I'm about to open up your word. I sometimes feel half retarded. Can you please help me understand what I'm about to read, or lead me somewhere where someone else can help me understand it, or another book or something like that? God, I'm about to exercise. You gave me a meat chassis. I only get one of them. I am to honor you with all things, heart, soul, mind, and spirit. And I'm going to honor you with my body. Please bless me through this time. How you approach everything, work, your relationships, your friendships, all those different things change when you can tether it to something real. Because I'm always curious for people that are ardent atheists. They believe we are highly evolved chimps that wear pants and talk and figured out fire somehow, but we used to be fish that used to be goo, that used to be stardust, and that stardust all came from nowhere at no time for no purpose, and just poof, and then it happened. I'm like, what are you doing any of these things for? Like, other than temporary pleasure or some sort of hedonistic end. But when you can attach it to the person and work of Christ, it's more than just, hey, I know where I'm going to go when I die. It's like, no, it makes your entire life in every level better.
For sure it does. I mean, it's all encompassing, and every aspect of how I look at things is through that lens, which again is just the sense of peace and calm and relief that I feel from that is impossible to overstate. It's been, again, just at the risk of sounding like a broken record, a life-changing event that has just shifted my perspective on how I look at everything, and in such a peaceful way. And for me, in terms of the looking at kind of the process that I think for me, and I think for a lot of people, and maybe to the point where one of the things you mentioned, a lot of times people have this kind of explosion of emotion, and then it fades away. Some of that, I think, is turning it into a sprint instead of a lifelong journey. Not to be dismissive or say that it's casual, because it's not, but in terms of not trying to overload yourself with too much too early. Mm-hmm. To me, it's kind of no different. I mean, that there's so much information and value in the Bible. And, to me, one of the things why I think trying to digest it in very small bits and really understand it, instead of, I want to read 20 pages today, I want to read 20 words 50 times over and over.
Let's go. Yeah.
Until I really understand what I'm reading, and for that day, similarly, like there's days where I'll spend a lot more time than others digesting scripture, or, watching interviews, or, just going down different kind of rabbit holes of historical research or what have you. Some days way more than others, but for me, I want to only bring into kind of my mental capacity what I'm capable of actually digesting, and not overload myself to where I get confused. And for me, that's worked really, really well, is to not try to, I got to read this book and then and this, and not do too much, and just say, I want to talk to God throughout the day, every single day. And where that leads me is completely up to Him. I want to continue to make a concerted effort and prioritize learning and becoming better versed and understanding in a higher capacity everything that I'm trying to understand. but I don't want to burn myself out and overload myself to a point where it's counterproductive.
Well, you're speaking to a lot of guys right now that are kind of in that place. So if you're high octane, if you're high energy, if you're super type A, you got to check boxes. Like you're the type of guy that has already done the task, but you will make another check box just so you can check that box, right? For something you've already done because you get satisfaction from it. But I had something that completely changed really my entire life. So this would have been the end of 2023. So I'm normally reading books for the podcast, and then I do a best books of the year podcast. So I'm keeping track throughout the year. Well, to prepare for interviews that year, in the first 11 months, I read 54 books to prepare for podcast interviews. Wow. And I'm like, I'm the smartest man alive. I'm the smartest man that's ever lived. I read 54 books, and some of them were, they were between 250 and 500 pages. Like these were serious books. I wasn't reading pamphlets. And in an instant, Mike, I felt like God specifically shut everything off in my brain for 2 seconds so he could be like, hey, how much Bible did you read this year? And I was like, oh no. Like I definitely didn't read 58 or 53 or 54 chapters of the Bible this year. Did I read 54 pages of the Bible this year? And I realized, no, I'd got nowhere close. Because my job, which God gave me and sent me on this journey to do to help equip men to push back darkness and for me to equip men to push back darkness, led me to doing a bunch of Christian adjacent stuff. So I was reading books from Christian publishing houses and from Christian authors, and there would be scripture in there, here and there. But I wasn't reading the Bible on my own, just for my own understanding and to spend some time with God. And I was like, this is a disaster. And I immediately told some of my internal guys here what had happened. And I was like, I don't know what this means, but I got to fix it. And out of that was born the forging table, right? Where me and 4 other guys are sitting together and we're going through books of the Bible. And I say all that to say this. It's taken me a few years to approach and get to the place where you're kind of at right now. Because how we've approached the forging table is we pick a book of the Bible, and I didn't know what we were going to do. And so I'm like, let's just do, a chapter, an hour. And so I think we started with either Ephesians or Galatians. We did some random Proverbs and some Psalms. We did my favorite book of the Old Testament, Nehemiah. And then we decided we were going to do Matthew. So we hit the gospel, and then we go back to Genesis. And then even in Genesis, we would do 2 chapters or maybe even 3 because, kind of like speeding things along. But last year we were wrapping up, I think, Acts. And I was like, I feel like we should do Romans. But there's something different about Romans. And I could feel the gravity of Romans. And when you hear great pastors like Matt Chandler call Romans Mount Everest, and then it's like, well, how do you approach Mount Everest? Well, you don't sprint up it, right? You kind of have to go a ways and then stop and kind of settle and let your body acclimate before you can go any further. And so how we've approached the book of Romans is completely different. And I pitched it to my guys and they were all down. I'm like, we're just going to hit record. We're going to let the timer go for about an hour, and then we're just going to see where we go. And I think we got from Romans 1:1 to Romans 1:7 in 4 hours. Like that was the first chunk. We got through 7 verses. Now we were having fun and we're messing around and having some open conversations about random topics, but we have been scraping through the book of Romans. And, we're about to record some in Romans 7, and we've just been in Romans for all this time. And Mike, what that's done for my faith, just rereading the same 20 words over and over, trying to parse out some more meaning, having God communicate through that word, reading some other commentaries, listening to sermons about that. It has completely revolutionized my understanding. And what I'm noticing is I'm having more Bible just come out of me, right? Because when I was around Phil Robertson when he was still alive, my current pastor, Mark Hitchcock, who my audience has heard from a couple of times, when you squeeze those guys, Bible verses come out. It's not because they're being showy. It's not because, they went to Awana or Vacation Bible School and they memorized all these things and they just spout it out just like they would baseball statistics. It's just in there. And because I'm approaching it now, how you've described for yourself, you're approaching it, I feel like it's changed everything for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strange kind of correlation, I think, between, our professional lives, whether you work for somebody, you own a business, whatever, is that, the goal should be, I would hope, is that as you get older, you become more efficient at everything.
That's right.
And to me, that's kind of what it reminds me of. It's things that I've learned completely outside of faith that I know from a procedural or knowledge retaining standpoint or whatever are just more effective for me.
Yep.
And probably for most people. Again, to use another jiu-jitsu reference is it's instead of trying to learn 400 moves and suck at all of them and not be able to actually, finish any of them in a live roll,
I feel personally attacked, Mike, by you talking about that. Come on.
If the shoe fits.
Yeah, shut up.
But yeah, it's really, really learning the things that matter, and to me, the neat thing about faith, generally speaking, is that everybody's journey is their own. It's a little different. How you approach it, you get to pick how you approach it, and that's the one thing that I want to reiterate, I guess, as somebody who's kind of roller coastered or come full circle, is I think the kind of almost argumentative or combative nature with which I see a lot of, I guess, if you want to call them students of the cloth. I mean, I don't know what you would call them, faith-based podcasts or interviews, or even, some of the, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Cliff and Neckley or Neckel.
No one knows how to pronounce his last name. I don't even think he does. Yeah.
But to me,
the guy that goes and speaks on college campuses and engages with them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's an element of that type of interaction that, for me personally, I just don't like.
Yeah.
I find a level of combativeness to it where there's like arrogance and dismissiveness and almost like you're dumb for even having this question kind of vibe to it. And I'm not trying to attack Cliff. I'm sure he's a great guy. But when I look at, having had different points in my life where I was in the people who are questioning this guy's shoes, to me, I find that I would approach any relationship you have with any other human being on the planet, especially in one where you're trying to witness or evangelize your faith, which is, the core element of your being, approach that the same way that you would approach your wife.
With a tenderness and
yeah. I mean, be kind even if you're angry, right? Yeah. Be calm even if you're, or be calm when you're angry, be kind when you're hurt. Like in those instances, when you approach somebody, if you want to do the what would Jesus do, is that obviously none of us were around to witness any of his life, but all we have to go off of his words. But if you look at the theme that is Jesus, is that there's that recurring theme of what, from my perspective, seems like it's that.
Yeah.
It's being kind and calm in all circumstances. Now, it doesn't mean if somebody attacks you that you don't fight back. It doesn't mean that you don't train to be dangerous and capable if the situation calls on it. And I do that. But when you're interacting with people, and I see like some of these roundtables on podcasts and stuff where you get some of these young guys who are arguing, like yelling at each other about, whether it's Catholicism versus Orthodox versus Protestant, and they're arguing like they're politicians arguing policy. To me, it does a huge disservice, I think, to people who are unsure of what to believe, or if they believe, or are curious about what Christianity or any faith is, for that matter, to step into that world and see people who are supposed to be on the same side treating each other with, distasteful discourse where it just comes across as the vinegar versus the honey thing. And I think, again, this is just my opinion, and there's plenty of people that would, I'm sure, chastise me for having this opinion. But when I look at least how I want to conduct myself, it's in a way where, going back to the politician thing, I get that evangelizing is a core component, but from my perspective, it's also about efficiency and effectiveness. And from my perspective, the most effective way to evangelize is to make your presence and the tenderness, grace, kindness, and compassion that you conduct yourself with everybody, no matter how they treat you, no matter what they think, no matter how much they're chastising you for being wrong about what you say you're right about, nothing comes across better than conducting yourself that way and being kind first. And I just see so much of the opposite of that out there.
Well, and you've seen this, and this is within Christendom and outside Christendom as well. Somebody who on stage or when they're performing or in front of a camera, they're incredibly personable and likable and all those different things. And then when you meet them off stage, you're just like, ugh, never meet your heroes is kind of the thing. And so certainly your witness as a Christian matters, whether there's a camera on you or you're just, in a coffee shop meeting somebody. I mean, look, this morning a guy came up, I guess he noticed me at breakfast and all that. And he even mentioned, he was very sheepish. He's like, I'd seen you before and I wanted to come up. And what I try to do in a situation like that, I know I have a weird job. I know I have a weird face. It's hard to hide. I try to ask them about them. Like, let's get some, hey, how'd you hear about this? Or like, hey, well, why didn't you come up and say hi last time? And, oh, are you going to be there next week? Like that kind of thing, just to take a little bit of the sting out of the interaction. But a lot of it just comes down to authenticity. And do you actually believe the things that you're saying? And does that work itself out in what you're doing? So some of my favorite apologists, J. Warner Wallace, John Lennox, Wes Huff is like what we talked about. And on the female side, you got like, Elisa Childers, Melissa Doherty, some of those folks. They're so winsome and like they interact with people in such a nice and genuine way on and off stage. Now, some of my favorite people on this planet are preachers. When they're on stage, they are the same person that they are, just a little bit louder and personality turned up about 15 to 20%, but they're the same person, right? You're not going to get this inequity that you get in some people that get on stage and talk about, hey, give generously to the brethren and blah, blah, blah. And then they're just these horrible, awful people that take advantage of everybody on the outside. But I think that's the important thing for just everybody listening to this is if you're not personally drawn to Christian apologetics, God probably put a different desire inside of your spirit. Now, from Paul's letters, we get all of us should have an apologia or an apologia for the faith that we have. We should be able to explain it, but not everybody is called to argue it professionally. Yeah. So if you can't explain why you have the faith that you have, that's a problem. But you don't need to train and get a degree in an advanced degree in Christian apologetics. And that's the thing that I want everyone to kind of hear, because you brought up something, a lot of these debates and arguments, like, the further you get into Christianity, it'll be like, which Bible's the best and which translation, and are you Calvinist or Armenian? Like, are you Reformed or are you super Reformed? But even at this table, Mike, we've had some times where these are my brothers, right? These are my guys, where some guys walk out of the room and they are pissed off, right? Because maybe they felt like the other three guys at the table were ganging up on them, or maybe they didn't feel like they could fully get their opinion out, or maybe they were disappointed in how they expressed their opinion because they could have sounded smarter. But what almost always happens is a couple of things. Given enough time, whether it be hours or maybe weeks, they realize, I was kind of acting like an idiot. Or, man, my pride really got in the way. Man, my ego made me think that I was better than that person because of insert random argument here. And then they kept coming back to realizing what actually happened at this table was healthy. This person saw the text or a particular topic in one way. This person saw it in a different way. We both expressed our opinions. At some point, both of us thought we were right, but then we just let the conversation be the conversation, because there are core doctrines that you have to believe in order to be a Christian. You have to believe in God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. You have to believe that God sent Jesus down here to pay for our sins and that he rose on the third day. You have to believe in a literal hell. You have to believe in a virgin birth. Like, those are things that are not debatable. Then there's a bunch of stuff that is. When should someone be baptized, right? As a baby or as a believer? Is baptism essential for salvation? What kind of music is allowed to be played in the sanctuary? Do we do hymns or do we do contemporary music? Here's a particular topic of theology that we find to be really, really important, but this other denomination thinks it's not important at all. Those are all at best secondary issues, and most of them are tertiary and beyond. They're important, they're interesting, young earth, old earth, all that. But it's like, are these things that we're going to clink our glasses together in heaven and realize, Mike was right, I was wrong? Or is this core doctrine? And I think for a lot of people, and you're probably already seeing this, some people will elevate their secondary or tertiary issue into primary cornerstone doctrine area. And that's how they argue it, which will lead to those podcasts that, you and a lot of other people detest.
Yeah. I mean, I love the way you explained all of that, and I couldn't agree more. And for me, I'm going to use another jiu-jitsu reference.
Let's go.
It is, to me, agreed that the core doctrine is what it is, and those are tenets that are not negotiable. For me, that's what I focus on, and really everything outside that. Just like I'm not trying to do an inverted berimbolo octopus guard, I'm trying to do a head.
That's a real thing, by the way. He didn't just make that up.
I'm trying to do a head and arm choke.
Yep.
I'm trying to get into side control. I'm trying to do a basic rear naked choke. Like I'm not really focused on what to me. And this again is just for me. I love and appreciate how you kind of brought all of that together in the grand scope of it's for some people, it's not for others. It's a great reminder for me because I'm just not one of those people that focuses on what for me is more white noise. Not to say that those things aren't important, but if they're not at the core belief system that I subscribe to, I'm not particularly worried about it, nor am I really interested in arguing with anybody about, well, this text says this and this document says that, and this person said this, and so if you look at historically what was going on at that time, it probably meant this. And like, to me, I look at it from the broader spectrum of what's the point? Is that at the end of the day, all of us are making assumptions as to, like, yes, some are easier to back up to a certain degree or even prove on paper, maybe more than somebody else. But ultimately, does it really matter from my perspective, being right or wrong, or maybe a little misguided? It doesn't. Not naive to the fact that some people they're into it. They love the healthy debate and it's super interesting and maybe even healthy for them to live their life that way. For me, it's not. I like to keep everything as simple as possible and really just focus on kind of the basic principles, really, of everything, whether it's faith, jiu-jitsu, health, nutrition, working out, whatever. We were talking about that at breakfast. Like, your gym looks a lot like my gym. Like, it doesn't need to look like The Rock's 40,000 square foot warehouse of, every piece of equipment you need. Like, I want to focus on the core things, the big heavy movements, a few auxiliary exercises, nutrition. Like, I don't count stuff. I eat very, very core principles of how I eat, but I don't get super into the weeds. Even with dog training, I'm more that way because the dog training industry is very much that way. I think it's human nature for anyone who spends the majority of their adult life and profession doing a thing to get really into the weeds in that thing. I see dog trainers all the time arguing about, well, this technically is negative reinforcement, not positive punishment. And well, what you did here is, you should do this. And, it's like, there are a lot of different ways to train a dog. Some of them work better than others. Some of them work better for me than they do other people, and vice versa. I like to keep the very core basic principles of, if it's something I want to occur again, I'm going to positively reinforce it. If it's something I don't want to have happen, I'm going to extinguish it. That's it. Like, it's really not any more complicated than that. And there's people who will write books or spend hours arguing with people about what quadrant of operant conditioning this technique is in, or, whatever. And to me, that kind of stuff reminds me of that, of that it's white noise, it's a distraction. And ultimately it feels very conflictive towards each other and not a brotherly love or a very Christ-like interaction. I could be totally misguided. That's just how it comes off to me.
So we've kind of like circled the wagons on jiu-jitsu a whole bunch on the show so far. We've made a bunch of references to it, but so I've been training for, I think as of right now, it's right at 9 years. So got a couple of stripes on my brown belt, and experienced everything in between. I've had the injuries. I've had to take, time off for surgery, things like that. But for the most part, if I'm healthy, I'm not missing class. Now, there are times when I'm traveling, got stuff going on with the kiddos. But what I've seen with a lot of guys is they end up taking 6 months off because, 1 week turns into 2, which turns into 3 months, which turns into crap. Do I know how to jiu-jitsu anymore? But I know the feeling of, if I miss 2 weeks of class, which you've missed a couple weeks of class because you had a little tweak in your knee. Like, if I miss 2 weeks of class, I feel like, I don't know if I know how to jiu-jitsu anymore. Like, I walk into class with this like low level anxiety, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to like do this. Like, do I know the takedown? Am I going to like find my positioning or whatever? And then, it's like riding a bike, you get back in there. But I'm curious for you, you had this long career in SEALs. Obviously, you've done a lot of shooting. You know how to sick dogs on people, which you did on me. Again, at my own request, right? The video's out there on the internet somewhere of me getting attacked by one of your dogs, putting on that 40-pound bite suit and getting smoked by one of them. But like, why did you even get into jiu-jitsu? Because for a lot of guys that I've noticed, they're very accomplished. They dominate certain levels of their life, and then they don't want to do anything new. And if they do something new, it'll be golf or something like that. If you like golf, great. I hate it, but like if you like it, whatever. I don't really care. But that's not a transferable skill. Like learning to chip a ball into the green, isn't going to help you in a kinetic situation where you need to protect yourself, right? Unless you're going to be chipping the guy's shins as he's trying to like murder your entire family or something like that. But I'm just curious. I'm always curious. Like for somebody that got into jiu-jitsu at the age you got into it, why did you decide to do that? Because that doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people.
Yeah. So first, and to be fair, I'm not a fan of golf. I don't play. I don't like it. I do think that they're just like with everything. It's one of those things where for some people, it's a huge or even life-changing thing that they become a part of. There is a mental aspect to it that's significant. I think, getting out with your buddies and having a few drinks or whatever, if that's what you're into, and being outside and walking a few miles is great for people. I agree with you. I don't play golf. I don't like it. But for jiu-jitsu, there's kind of a number of things. I mean, one, in the SEAL teams, like you do combatives. It's very different in that it's, one, the deck is stacked in your favor significantly, in that there's usually 16 or more of you, or at least 4 of you in a room with 1 or maybe 2 guys. You're going to have a primary and a secondary weapon that you can either shoot or strike somebody with. If you do have to go hands-on, it's going to be, 2 guys have long guns on them, and then 1 or 2 guys is sweeping in on them, and so it's very different than one-on-one grappling and combatives in a wrestling nature. Having said that, it's still part of what we do, and I enjoyed it. As I approached 40, I had trained a little bit off and on, not enough to even say I was training. It was, a class or a couple of weeks here or there or whatever, scattered over a 10-year period. And right around the time I hit 40, there was a couple things. One, my kids, I had put them in jiu-jitsu. There was a good MMA and jiu-jitsu gym not far from where we were living at the time. I really liked their coach. Watching them do it, it kind of gave me the bug a little bit of like, man, I miss, rolling around with, dudes who are, giving me all I can handle. And, I miss and enjoyed that aspect of training. Also, just training, occasionally. And as I'm getting older, I'm seeing, teenagers who are giving me a run for my money, which is a humbling experience. Yeah. And then strangely, or maybe not strangely enough, my ego, and I've talked about this a couple of times, but Andy Stump was at an airport, I think, and did one of those, like, ask me anything. I'm, laid over for 2 hours, and somebody said, Mike Ritland and Joe Rogan get in a fight, who wins? And Andy was like, Joe would mop the floor with Mike, hands down. And I read it, and I was like, this hurts for 2 reasons. One, because I thought we were buddies, and 2, because Andy. It's true.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, you probably would. And I joke about that, but that was part of it. I was like, what, I probably should start training again. And there were, other things, just wanting to add something to the physical repertoire of things that I was doing. But I also, as I've gotten older, have realized, I wouldn't say my body's failing me, but I'm not in my prime anymore, and to me, one of the core components of being a man, a father, head of a household is being able to protect and provide. And I always, to the best of my ability, want to be able to do both of those, right, also to the best of my ability. And so a lot of different reasons, the last one being, a lot of guys that I've known and love and trust over the years, talk about how much of a benefit jiu-jitsu has brought to their life that has nothing to do with the physical aspect or even the self-defense or combatives aspect. It was the mental challenge and the 3D mental and physical chess and the almost physical meditation that accompanies it, because you're so singularly focused on one thing, which in a world of YouTube and smartphones and iPads and everything becomes increasingly more difficult to focus on one thing at a time. And that's been the biggest unintended positive consequence for me is the mental health. Again, not that I've ever struggled with that, very fortunately, and thank God that that's been the case. I've never found myself in a situation where I felt like I was struggling mentally at all. But even with that, again, just kind of like finding Christ, not looking for it, I started jiu-jitsu. And even though I felt, like I'm in a pretty good place mentally, I still found, a supercharging of that feeling and that effect of a calmness. And I also think the confidence that you gain in training for, long enough to get to where it's like, okay, I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing, at least a little bit. That confidence is the same level of confidence that I feel from carrying, from having a very capable dog, for having my house set up with cameras, with door devils, with blast-proof glass, with solid core doors, with certain things to make it more difficult for somebody to break into or to attack our house or whatever. The thing with that, though, is that you always have it. You may not have your dog, you may not have your gun. That confidence that you gain from, some pretty good-sized young athletic dude rolling through the door, and you can not just hang with him, but control him and realize, man, I feel pretty capable. There's always somebody tougher, but I feel like, no matter what, somebody's going to have to earn it, even if they get the best of me. Like they're not going to get away scot-free, or probably not. And that I think avalanches, like it becomes almost addictive, that feeling, the endorphins, the adrenaline, the cortisol dump, the dopamine hit of progressing and getting better. And there's so many parallels between life of the peaks and valleys that jiu-jitsu is, whether it's injuries or training plateaus or frustrations or hiccups or busy schedules. You have to manage expectation. You have to, figure out how to stay calm. And one of the nice things about the SEAL teams is you do get a lot of practice at staying calm in really difficult and dangerous situations. Some of them translate, most of them translate, I would say, to jiu-jitsu, but it's always good to continue to put yourself in positions where you have to force yourself to think through them, even though you're uncomfortable or, almost out of air or whatever. And so, all of those things kind of combined is what made me start to get back into it. And then just the more I did it, the more I wanted to do it. And as I've progressed, I, continue to enjoy it. Now, I will say my kind of thought process or intention behind doing it is different, I think, than most, in that I approach it the same way I approach everything else. I try to be hyper consistent really in all areas of my life. I digest and obtain jiu-jitsu knowledge the same way I approach the Bible, the same way I approach really anything, is I dive head first, and that but is I always try to be really intentional to not overwhelm myself, and also to stick to the basics. If there's one thing that I learned at a very early age in the SEAL teams is that, we use many adages. Half of them are not appropriate. 90% of them are not appropriate for this show, but like a lot of people say, train until you get it right, and one of the things we kind of live by is don't train until you get it right, train until you can't get it wrong. You only do that by doing the basics, and you master the basics. And if I was never at Dev Group, but the tier 1 guys, like I know a ton of them, and that's one of the things that they talk about pretty religiously is, they spend so much time on a flat range from 5 to 15 meters doing the very basic stuff so many times to where they never have to think about it again. And so I approach jiu-jitsu that same way, where I know what my limitations are physically. I for my age, I think I'm maybe above average athleticism and take probably better care of myself than a lot of guys my age, but I'm not 32. I'm never going to be that from a physical prowess standpoint at that level that I was at that age. And so I tailor my goals, my training methodology, my schedule even to how often I train and how hard I train and who I train with, and communicating kind of what I'm trying to accomplish and reminding my coach and any potential training partners of that all the time, because I'm here for these reasons and really these reasons only. And it's not to compete, whether it's, straight jiu-jitsu competitions or even MMA. I have no desire. Like, I don't care if I get a black belt or not. I mean, would I have loved to have had one by the time I'm 50? Sure, but I don't really care, and I'm probably not going to have it at this rate. But it doesn't matter. I mean, to me, it's wanting to be as capable as I can be, but for the long haul. I don't want to, get over my skis of training so much to where it's taking away from other things in my life. I don't want to focus so heavy on getting the next promotion or, trying to enter this competition or whatever, to where it takes away from the core belief system that I have of why I started training in the first place, which is to be as competent and capable as possible should the need arise for me to actually go hands-on with somebody in a real life scenario. And so that's been kind of the backbone of it all.
Well, you're hitting a lot of things. Like, I remember early on in white belt, there was someone that got promoted. And in my mind, I was like, well, they're not very good. Like, I beat them every time we roll, right? Why are they getting promoted? And looking back on even just who I was mentally when I got started, because I got started at the age of 30, it's like, God, you just had such a stupid, ignorant view of what this is, because it's not where do you rank against everyone else at that belt level? It's a good academy will evaluate you at your age, your level of training, the frequency with which you train, whether you're training to compete, training to fight, or just training to be a capable human being. And who are you compared to the guys that are in your age range around your athletic ability and your size?
Yeah.
So there are guys that have their purple belts that would get smoked by let's say you're a 50-year-old purple belt and some kid walked in that wrestled at Oklahoma State and he's got 3 stripes on his white belt and he's got, world-class takedowns and control, and he's 40 pounds stronger than you. He's more athletic. He's faster and all of that. Can he beat you? Yes. Go to a tournament and put on that red belt, so they know who gets what points and whatever. You're probably going to get beat, right? You may even get finished. But where are you at in terms of guys that are around your size, at your age, your level of training, at your belt? And I'll say for me, I know when everything started to slow down and I felt like, I kind of know what I'm doing. It was at some point in purple belt, right? Now, I remember when I got my purple belt, Rush Sweatman, who was my first jiu-jitsu instructor, and, he was a purple belt at the time, and he's still a purple belt. But I remember him telling me when I got my purple belt, he's like, you're a certified butt kicker now. Like, that's, all things being equal, you're not going to lose a street fight. Now, if a guy that's, 6'8" with abs and super jacked and has tremendous physical advantages, like, you might still be able to beat him, but you're going to lose some brain cells and, there's going to be a pound of flesh that's going to have to happen. But I just remember at purple belt being like, everything is slowed down.
Yeah.
Like, everything is slowed down now, where kind of like what you said earlier, even if I can't stop what the other person is doing, I know what they're doing. Even if I can't do what I want to do, I know what I want to do. I know the position I want to be in. I want to know kind of all that. But for you, where along your journey did you feel like, not, hey, I'm good, I don't need to do this anymore, but it's like, hey, things have slowed down enough to where I feel like, yes, I kind of have an idea of what I'm doing?
Really the same. I would say probably the first stripe on my purple belt, that was the case. I would say when I got purple, so I've had 2 coaches. The first coach I had was a guy that grew up under the Marcelo Garcia gym and academy in Dallas.
Dude,
and
talk about killers.
Yeah, and was, I would say pretty heavy into the MMA scene, grappling in MMA scene in the North Texas or, that region of the country even for a number of years. Very good kickboxer and just all around really good fighter. Spent the first 3.5 years with him. The last 3.5 years or so, I've been with a guy named Rodrigo Lopez, who the gym's called North South in Dallas, and very competitive gym, very high level. Lots of world-class competitors at every age and belt, and he's been an MMA fighter for a couple of years now, and lots of accolades, what have you. Two very at first distinct different styles. The first 3.5 years was very catch wrestling, MMA grappling, not maybe as technically sound, but effective for what I'm looking for. So It was a great fit.
And can be more brutal, certainly.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then the last 3.5 years, at first it was, kind of hyper technical compared to what I was used to, which was good because I hadn't been focusing as much on maybe such clean technique. But as he's kind of progressed through his career and gotten more and more into MMA fighting, and now has done a few MMA fights with a world class, one of the best in the world coaches, there's been this cool transformation that we've kind of come back to that. So I've kind of had a very fortunate, nice kind of 50-50 to both sides. To your question, though, I would say when Rodrigo gave me my first stripe at purple, is around the time where I really felt like this makes sense now. When I first got purple belt, there was a little bit of imposter syndrome, but very quickly I reminded myself two things. Number one is that, don't sell yourself short ever. Don't be overly confident, but have confidence in your own ability. But the broader question, and this is for anybody out there that experiences that, I would ask you, for anybody who gets promoted and questions whether or not they deserve it, to me, that's actually a bigger problem than I think people realize, and not for the individual themselves, but for your coach. Is that, to me, if you're questioning your coach's opinion and judgment on when you progress and promote, you shouldn't be training with that guy.
Right.
To me, it's really that simple, is that if you don't trust him enough to promote you, why are you training with him? And just turning that kind of paradigm on its head and looking at it from that perspective, that imposter thing went away immediately. It's one thing if somebody asks you to come speak and you're like, dude, what, you're asking me to come talk? But to me with jiu-jitsu, when you're paying a coach to evaluate and put you through your path and determine when you're ready to promote to the next stripe, the next belt, et cetera, you either trust him or you don't. And if you don't, pick somewhere else where you're not going to feel that way.
Well, I remember like you're speaking on a lot of the stuff that I felt, because when I got my blue belt, and again, it's embarrassing to say, but I try to lay myself out there and all my faults as well. I felt entitled to my blue belt. I felt like I had been a blue belt. And then when I got it, I was like, yeah, I deserve this. But when I got promoted to purple, I remember saying a week or two before promotion, because the Forge in Edmond, we do promotion nights typically 2 days a year where you'll have people go, from kids all the way to adults, we'll get promoted, and it's kind of big bull in the ring style for several hours, and, that kind of a thing. And, we'll have 50, 60 people just coming in, rotating in on us at all times. And I remember about a week or two before promotion night for purple belt, somebody asked me, like, hey, Kyle, you ready to get your new belt? Like, no one knows until that night, right? Like, who's getting promoted for the most part. And I said, dude, I am closer to white belt than I am to purple. That's where I'm at in my journey. And that was not like faux, like humility. That was legit. I was like, I do not feel like I'm close to a purple belt. And when we got to promotion night, because everybody shows up because it's your job, you're either going to get promoted or you're going to be there to help someone else get promoted. So you, as a teammate, you got to be there. They called my name to test for purple, and I was like, oh no, this is a disaster. Not like I wasn't going to get through the gauntlet, but I was like, I'm not a freaking purple belt. Like, what is happening? Yeah. And so go through the ringer, get my purple belt and all that. And almost immediately I had that exact same realization that you just talked about. I was like, do I really want to disagree with the black belts at our academy as to what they think I am? Because if they think I'm a purple belt, then that's exactly what I am. Yeah. And our gym doesn't have a huge reputation of sandbagging, because some gyms will sandbag so that they can keep winning tournaments, right? So you'll have a guy that's clearly a purple belt, but he'll keep running off gold medals at these blue belt tournaments, and finally gets to a point where some of the other coaches from other academies will talk to the coaches and be like, hey man, like, we get it, y'all promote slowly, but come on. Like, this guy's clearly advanced past this. Like, it's time for them to get their belt. And then I try to tell people, because I'll talk to frustrated white belts and blue belts about, I haven't been promoted yet, or I haven't gotten a stripe in months, and blah, blah, or whatever the thing is. And I'm like, bro, you do not want to be the worst purple belt on the planet. you would much rather be one of the baddest blue belts in your area. That's what you would rather be. And then I remember when I got my brown belt, because typically the longest gap is at blue belt, right? The gap between white and purple is typically the longest. And then when I got my brown belt, I didn't really have any of those thoughts. I was like, okay, wasn't expecting the brown belt, got called to test for it, and I got my brown belt. I trust my coaches. I trust the professors. I trust the people making that call. But with each successive belt, you have to reckon with defending what that piece of dyed cloth means.
Yeah.
Right. And so, because I know guys that have quit at purple belt. I mean, plenty of people quit at white belt and blue belt, but they get all the way to purple belt and then they just kind of, it's good enough. I know guys that have gotten to brown belt and have stopped training. And for me, I'm like, that's crazy. Like you're knocking on the door, like just keep the mat time going and you'll eventually get your black belt. And then I know guys that have gotten their black belt and then stopped training.
Yeah.
And it's to each their own. I'm certainly not here to judge, their training regimen or where they're at in their life and what they find to be important. But with each successive belt, you look back, and I actually do this on my show because I'll record an episode. I have one called blue belt, I have one called purple belt, and I have one called brown belt. And I kind of look back on the lessons that I've learned about jiu-jitsu, about myself over that time period. And when I try to tell these adult males that I just pound all the time, like, you got to train, you got to train, you got to train, because I want them to have the same benefits that I did. Because jiu-jitsu will reveal things about you physically and mentally, right? If you're a little bit soft in your body, jiu-jitsu is going to reveal that. If you're a little bit overweight, if you're a little bit underweight, if you're a little weak, if you're a little bit too inflexible, jiu-jitsu is going to expose that. But if you've got some detrimental parts of your personality, ego being the biggest one, right? Jiu-jitsu is going to expose that. And for a lot of guys, it's ego that keeps them from training because, we've had guys that used to play in the NFL that'll roll into our gym and here they are. They've been throwing bodies around and people around and dominating people for their entire lives. And then they get in there and some 16-year-old kid wraps them up in a pretzel and they're immobile. They can't move. And the level of frustration grows. And then basically they leave, they never train again. And then they just have some sort of hermeneutic in their brain of like, well, that wasn't a real life situation. And had it been like a real situation, I would have just seen red and bodies would have started to fall and all that. And aside from that being not even close to being true, it's that person has lost an opportunity to develop as a man because they ran into their ego and they internalized this and said, I don't need to do this. It's not going to matter. Or I'm just going to go shoot more at the range and all that. But it's exactly what you said. I asked these guys, what if you get in a fight at an airport, right? What if you're traveling without your firearm? You're on vacation with your family. You're on a road trip or something like that. It's you and the bad guy at the gas station in the parking lot. You don't have a blade. You don't have a firearm. You have nothing. You have you. You have your limp wrists and your untrained body. Yeah. And so it's like, what do you expect to do? But that's been the biggest thing for me on the jiu-jitsu side is you don't know what you don't know about yourself. Even if you're a really introspective guy, you need the kinetic nature of what that hobby or sport is to kind of show you those things about yourself.
100%. And for me, starting at 40, if I look back and kind of ingest some of the things that you just mentioned, it lines up pretty exact, and for me, I think ego was the biggest thing that I needed to get rid of at 40, and because, going through SEAL training at 18 and spending 12 years in that environment, which is a long enough time to where I would never say that I was, an expert SEAL, but you're good enough to feel kind of similar, like, I know what I'm doing. It's always, better guys. The first few years in the SEAL teams is very similar to the first few years in jiu-jitsu where you feel like, dude, I'm never going to be good at this. Like I have I'm watching these guys who've been here for 10 years and they're like Jedis and I'm never going to be that. But then you get to that point and feel like you at least have some idea what's going on. And then, at that same time, I've been working with and training dogs most of my life, jump right into that or transition into that and then spend, a long time doing that and becoming what I think a lot of people probably within the industry would consider as a subject matter expert to a certain extent, at least within some realms of dog training, and being asked to come speak at national conferences where there's 1,000 handlers from all over the world coming to attend myself and a handful of other instructors' classes, and So in both of those areas, they're very, if you look at jiu-jitsu as in the broad scope of American society, like what it's viewed as, it's a very masculine, alpha male, kind of thing, that people do. Well, so is being a SEAL, and so is being a dog trainer of dogs who, work for military and police. And so like I'd spent really all of my adult life, or, the middle part of my adult life, the last decade plus, being in a position where I was respected and felt like I was kind of near, the upper echelons of the industry. Again, if you look at SEAL teams compared to the military, military and police dog trainers compared to dog trainers, or just, within society of dog owners, which most people are, is that's kind of a notch above and looked at that way. And then you go as a 40-year-old accomplished businessman and SEAL and dog trainer and whatever into a mat where you're getting just absolutely clowned over and over.
Clown's probably the perfect word for it.
And over and over and over by people that, if I ran into them at a gas station, I wouldn't look twice at them. And I would be like, not to say I'm better than this guy, but there is a feeling of ego and confidence of like, when I look at my life as a snapshot, how is this guy doing to me what he's doing to me, especially when I come from these industries that are very AA personality, very highly respected from the warrior ethos type of mentality. And for me, that was by far the biggest benefit that I got from jiu-jitsu, was completely leveling my ego and putting it in my back pocket and never really letting it out again, other than when it seems like it's going to be actually productive. And I feel like it's done so much for me in that way of really balancing my ego out, which has, I would say, cascaded into so many other every other aspect of my life, whether it's my relationship with my kids, of being calmer and more present and more balanced and more even keeled with them, and any professional relationship of not taking things personally or wanting to get back at somebody, or even personal relationships, similar, like being kind and not allowing any part of my ego to inject itself in a way that's counterproductive, or at least compared to what I was prior to starting that journey. It's certainly tampered a significant amount. And so, to me, that by itself for me was life-changing, no doubt about it.
Well, and so I want to go back to what you were talking about in terms of doing the basics, because we live in the era where everyone's trying to hack everything. Everything's a biohack. Yeah. And so it's like, and look, I love listening to Huberman and Peter Attia and some of those guys. And if there's things that I can do that are simple modifications to my life that are going to make me 5% better mentally while I'm preparing a podcast or doing an interview or writing something, like, sure. Like I want to find those things. I don't want to do things that are going to hurt me physically. I don't want to do things that are going to set me back, or, I'm getting a boost now, but I'm deleting years off the end of my life, or whatever that thing is. And so I kind of take that same attitude into everything that I do, what I ingest, what I end up doing, whatever. But some people think that they can hack jiu-jitsu by doing more things that are more complicated than the basics. Right. Okay. And so maybe they're white belt, blue belt level, gi, no gi, doesn't really matter. And so they will sacrifice mat time or drilling time, and they will maximize the brutal, 2-hour open mat classes where it's just round after round after round. They'll go get some Danaher videos and they'll study those. They'll scroll, like their algorithm just basically shows them tournament and, jiu-jitsu stuff. And then, they're looking at all these very complicated guards, right? Maybe they're doing donkey guard or Z guard or octopus guard or something like that. Maybe they end up being attracted to things that don't even fit their body.
Your favorite, the rubber guard?
Yeah, of course, rubber guard. But you have someone that's inflexible that's trying to become a rubber guard guy. You have someone that's built like a bowling ball, like with no neck and short arms and short legs, and they're trying to, Darce choke everybody or trying to like triangle everybody. It's like, your body's not super meant for that kind of a game. But it's like they think they're going to game the system or get better so much faster by looking at the complicated things. And so they spend all this time, worried about berimbolo and worried about all these different things that they can't even spell. And they don't know how to do a sufficient takedown that's going to work on most opponents. Yeah. They're not worried about being able to much less get to side control, just hang on to side control, to finish the north-south choke, to get to mount and not just get bucked off immediately, head and arm choke, guillotine, RNC, maintaining back control, these very, very basic things. And what I try to, impose or at least encourage in some of these younger guys in jiu-jitsu is like, look at the Gracies and specifically look at Rickson Gracie. Okay. Everybody knows Royce because of UFC 1 and 2 and, bringing jiu-jitsu to the world and introducing everyone to this superpower through this, unassuming package, a guy that weighed about 170 pounds and wasn't jacked or whatever. Rickson was always the guy. If you read his book, you can see whenever he beat his brother and he became the family champion. And back in those days, that was the gym storm days, where guys would just show up at the gym and say, this doesn't work. I'm about to prove it. Let's go. And Rickson had to answer the call, right? He was always the one that answers the call. He was the family champion. And he dominated people with the basics, right? And some of my favorite stories of Rickson is when he would go and do these seminars. So he's got these black belt seminars, right? And at the end of the seminar, he would just line up the black belts and tap everyone one at a time. He would even let them start with him in a bad position. So he would let them start on his back with the rear naked choke in, and he would work from there. And then he would tell this black belt, and he wasn't doing it to embarrass him. He's like, I'm going to arm bar your left arm, or hey, I'm going to shoulder lock your right side. And so what he's trying to do, and you just can't stop it. He was never inverting. He was never doing any of these obscure guards. You might be like, well, it hadn't been invented yet. But he dominated people with the basics. Look at someone like Marcelo Garcia, not a very big guy, right? And what he was able to do in his competitive career was astonishing, given his physical limitations. But how was he beating people? Razor sharp technique. And then look at the greatest, it's not really arguable, but the greatest no-gi grappler of all time, Gordon Ryan. Gordon will say it, and also John Danaher, his main professor, will say it. He's not very athletic. He's not quick. He's not fast. Now, when he was, when his blood type was essentially Tropicana at his juiciest, of course he was strong, but he didn't beat Andre Galvao at the super fight at ADCC because he was so jacked. He beat him with razor sharp technique. He does everything perfectly, and he essentially doesn't make mistakes in competition. And yet, with all that knowledge, you still have, especially these young guys, they're not drawn to the basics. They don't want to drill. They don't even want to do basic positional sparring because they're attracted by all like the super sexy stuff.
I would even take it a step further in that, I think it's easy or convenient for people to look at jiu-jitsu as a singular thing, as a competition or a sport, and minimize but street fight, right? There's some application, but it's not a one-to-one. Proving your point or trying to help you make the point, the most real-world petri dish application of what works and doesn't, to the closest thing to a real-world scenario that exists is MMA fighting.
Yep.
In the last 10 plus years of the UFC and any other division or group that puts on those fights, if you watch the Dagestanis, they're beating guys like Charles Oliveira with a head and arm choke, and like we said earlier, making him panic tap to something which is one of the first things you learn how to do in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, here, don't lose your train of thought. Just so everyone knows, this was Islam Makhachev. This is at 155. Charles Oliveira, at this point in his UFC career, had the record for most submissions in the history of the UFC, right? Which is, a testament to his longevity, but also his tremendous skill set. He's so unbelievably good at jiu-jitsu. And when Islam Makhachev transitioned to the side to finish the head and arm choke, one of the best jiu-jitsu practitioners ever panic taps. And a panic tap is, oh my gosh, like it's so fast and it's so brutal. He does kind of like that modified Darce where he doesn't come all the way to the bicep. He stops at his forearm. Yeah. And, we messed around with that at the Forge and some other places trying to figure out how he's doing that. And what that is a testament is he has been squeezing people and things since he was a baby, right? And again, back to your point, the Dagestanis are basically mastering the basics.
Yeah, I mean, they're beating people who, like Charles, is a world-class, multi-world champion jiu-jitsu practitioner just at jiu-jitsu.
Yep.
But you look at what they practice and train, none of it is super fancy, and again, going back to whether it's the dev group stuff or dog training, is that, really everything. And this is why I tend to approach really every aspect of my life, including faith, with, let me look at the basic core tenets, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And until I feel like I can move on from that, or need to move on from that, or even have any interest in moving on from that, I'm just going to focus on this until I can't get it wrong. But, there's another component to that incorporates jiu-jitsu, catch wrestling, regular wrestling, grappling, and it really boils down to a domination of hip strength and position.
Yeah.
And they're so good at balance, center of gravity, and moving their body around to make it oppressive on you and difficult for you to keep them from doing it. And they're so good at it that they dominate everybody, and you cannot argue with the track record of people from that region who have grown up in that type of training methodology and adhering to those core principles and just destroying everybody, and it's very, very basic stuff, but they just practice those things so many times and get so razor sharp at those basic techniques that they can't, or they can complete them on people that are world class that can't keep them from doing it. And to me, I don't know. I mean, what more proof could you need to know what to focus on?
Well, and I even tell, so for guys, I've encouraged them, when it comes to training, I don't think that's optional, but then we have to get into, okay, so what do we train? Does any martial arts, will any martial art do? No. Like I tell people all the time, it's like, it's got to be a real martial art that's been proven in the crucible of simulated battle, which is mixed martial arts. And so what are the modalities that are constantly used by the people that are the best? It's wrestling, it's jiu-jitsu, it's Western boxing, it's kickboxing, it's Muay Thai, it's judo, it's those types of things. It's not Wing Chun, it's not Kung Fu, it's not Krav Maga, it's not any of these, Aikido, it's not any of those things. And the easy proof is how many people in the history of the UFC that, competed at a high level, were in the top 10, were primarily speaking, their number one modality was karate. I'm thinking of Lyoto Machida, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. That's the list. Yeah. Okay. Now, which ones were Kung Fu guys? Can't name one. Which ones were Aikido guys? Can't name them, right? Even judo hasn't had a lot of, you've got someone like Kayla Harrison or Ronda Rousey. You had Carl Parisian back in the day. Those were mainly, judo was like their main thing. But the one thing now is a little bit different. The main status of the UFC, it's kind of all over the place. But consistently over the 30 plus years of mixed martial arts being a sport, an actual sport with rule sets and all those different things, it has been wrestling, jiu-jitsu, Western boxing, kickboxing.
Yeah.
Those are the main things that work out well, because people are like, well, hey, you mentioned Muay Thai. Well, the Muay Thai stance is not super conducive to stopping a takedown.
Yeah.
Right? And it puts your body in different positions. Well, then they're like, well, hey, how are these MMA fighters losing in boxing matches? I was like, because boxing is one thing. Your stance as an MMA fighter can't be a boxing stance, because you'll just get taken down or you'll get your legs kicked into oblivion. But there's a reason why boxers are not coming over to MMA. Because if Floyd Mayweather took one leg kick, fight's probably over. Yeah. And all these fancy punches and combinations and all that don't work when your shoulders are on the mat or on the ground or anything. But that's the other thing about the Dagestani style, that, everyone gets to choose what they want to be. Do you want to be competitive? Do you want to just be a good guy in the gym? Do you just want to train periodically? Everyone has their own goals. But as you and I talked about at breakfast, being influenced by, rolling and working out with guys like Robichaux, and I think Robichaux's a, fourth stripe black belt, so legit guy. I don't want my brain to default to something in a real world scenario that would not be conducive to dominating that real world scenario. And so there's something with competition jiu-jitsu, which a lot of people have complained about. It's the butt scooting thing. It's slap, bump, sit, and then they sit and they're just kind of like scooching towards their opponent. In the kinetic parking lot situation, and this guy's trying to knock your head off, are you going to sit on the ground and start scooting across the asphalt? Is that what you're going to do? Because one of the reasons why the Dagestanis are so dominant, they're not playing guard at all. They're getting the takedown, right? and then they're dominating top position, and then they're at least controlling the fight and or finishing the fight. Because when you're in top position, not only are you holding your partner down, but now they're also having to deal with gravity because they're below you. And with how gravity works, you've got gravity on your side if you're in top position. Now, if you're a guard player, if you like pulling guard, all those different things, and you do a lot of sport jiu-jitsu and competition jiu-jitsu, totally fine. Like, even if you're a dominant wrestler, you need to learn the guard. Like, I'm pro all those things. But I'll say for me, and for what sounds like with what you've done as well, you're trying to make sure most of your reps are in positions where you will be dominant, right?
Sure.
Because again, in a real world scenario, it's not just collar chokes and positioning. You can punch, you can elbow, like you can stab, you can do all these different things. And if I'm in a kinetic situation where I don't know how many people are involved, I would much rather have you on your back, me and knee on belly, and me have my head up to where I can feel where you are so I can keep you at bay. And is one of your buddies trying to come up and soccer kick my head into the next county? And again, but if you end up on the bottom, you have to be able to get out from that. And again, that's why I'm saying, hey, you still should know a little bit of guard. But again, if you're just a guy that's trying to be more martial in your abilities and to have that in your repertoire, like you've got to make sure you're dominating and becoming dominant in positions that would actually be useful in real life.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, one of the ways that, not that anybody's asking us to, reinvent jiu-jitsu competitions, but what I would like to see, even from if you're trying to grow the sport from a spectator base and from a general interest, is, something as simple as from whatever rule set, whether it's IBJJF or ADCC or NAGA, whatever, is that if you deduct 2 points for pulling guard, like I think that would stop a lot of that.
It would, yeah.
Is that, if you find yourself, in a inferior position, i.e. on your back, that's 2 points. Like that would fix a lot of that problem. I think. I don't know why they don't do that, but whatever. I mean, again, that's to each their own. For people that enjoy that and like the technical sport aspect of it, and that's what they're into, more power to you. I'm right there with you. I mean, for me, like I want to understand and be effective enough at guard to, one, to be able to protect myself, and two, to be able to get out of it and ultimately either stand up or reverse it and now end up in a dominant position. Because similarly, like I don't ever want to be on my back if I don't have to. If the guy is so much physically superior to me to where the only way I can finish it is from there, then yes, I need and want to be able to do that. But that's not going to be my MO. That's not going to be my strategy, is to put myself in that position ever. It's always going to be the exact opposite.
Well, yeah, and you also have to look at, okay, how do most matches normally progress in terms of the point scoring? There's typically 2 points for a takedown. Okay, and then you get points for passing, and then, okay, you're going to get points for knee on belly, and then points for mount, and then you work for the submission. That's how a lot of schools and a lot of places will kind of teach that. But one of the things that you have to remember as well is, how can I best neutralize the advantage that the person I'm going against has? Okay. So yeah. And again, if you're a guard player, which I would say there are world champion guard players that always play guard, and their game is predicated on the guard pull. They pull guard and then they sweep, or they pull guard and they submit, or something like that. Again, I'm pro all of those things. And if that's your thing, keep working it, baby. Keep sharpening that sword. The thing that I would add to the conversation is there are some people that have just distinct physical advantages to you. So I'm 5'10", 195 pounds, okay? As some guys at my gym would call, I am victim weight, right? Because I weigh less than 200 pounds, right? But like, we have this guy at the gym, he's a purple belt, he's really good, his name's Carl. Well, he is 6'4", 280. And he's lost weight to get to 280. And when I say lost weight, he wasn't sloppy. He was just farm strong, like deadlifting 800 pounds, probably just carrying around hay bales for the fun of it, just like thick, big wrists, big legs. So it's hard to deal with. So if we're standing, right, there's a distinct physical disadvantage for me when we are standing, right? But if I can get the fight to the ground where I am on top, I've now negated his size, a lot of it, right? Now, he's got the ability to just bench press me off of him, and he can do things. And I am not one of those guys that says, don't use your strength. Forget all that. Use your strength, right? Because it takes strength. It takes, for the most part, it takes a lot of effort to become strong. Some people are naturally strong and then they can add to it. Some people are not naturally strong and they can add to it. And so I would never tell someone, don't use your strength. You should know how to use the technique. You should know how to do it without using strength. But if you have strength, use it. And the reason why I say that is because people that are flexible, you never hear a coach say, don't use your flexibility.
Yeah.
They
don't
get
use
into
your cardio.
Yeah, don't use your cardio. Like, don't use your brain.
Yeah.
Right? Some people are just, their brains, they can see 7 steps ahead, whereas for the most part, like my game is more a step at a time, maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead, right? And so I want you to use everything that is at your disposal. But if your opponent is significantly bigger and stronger than you, and you can't take them to the ground and end up in a dominant top position, you're going to be at a deficient in a deficient position the entirety of the interaction. And it's like you should work to make sure that you're on the better part of that ledger.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. I don't have much to add. I mean, it just I feel the exact same way about it, and I would say adhere to all those same principles.
Well, here as we're kind of rounding to a close, we've talked about a lot of different things. I'm just curious for you as you kind of evolve into this next era of life, right? So as an entrepreneur, as a podcast host, as a trainer, all the things that you're doing, like what are the things that you're looking at doing? Because I get the same questions probably that you do, like, hey, are we just going to do the podcast for the next 10, 20 years, release 3 episodes a week? Is that what we're doing? But like when you look at kind of the things that you're doing and the things you're wanting to accomplish, like, are you going to be making any significant changes or what's kind of caught your eye?
I mean, for me, at the risk of sounding boring or even vague, I don't, it's the first time in my life where I don't really have a plan that way. I'll continue to, the Warrior Dog Foundation is a big part of what I do and frankly, who I am. It's a mission very near and dear to my heart.
I want to go ahead and explain that for everybody that's not familiar.
So, we take in former military, police, federal, working dogs, basically, that arrive at a point in their career where whatever entity they're with has had so many problems with them behaviorally and aggression-wise that they're opting to euthanize them versus either retiring them and rehoming them or whatever, and that's where we step in. So the overwhelming majority of working dogs get retired to their handler or somebody else in the unit that's familiar with them. That's most of them, but there are the kind of Hannibal Lecters out there that just do not play well with others and have certain quirks and things, behavioral tics about them that make it, too much of a liability to do that with them. And instead of euthanizing them, that's where we'll step in and take them. And so, I started it in August of 2010, so I've been doing it 16 years almost, taking in hundreds of dogs from everywhere. I mean, military, police, special operations, Secret Service, Customs, Border Patrol, you name it. And I want to continue to have the foundation be a resource for dogs like that so that they can live out their lives in dignity and grace and not just be euthanized when they're done with them. So I'll continue to do that until either somebody else kind of takes the helm or, ideally I would love for us to not even need to exist. One thing that a lot of people don't realize, there's no federal funding or grants for retired working dogs, whether it's military, police, whatever. And I think that's a travesty. B, it's also a problem, and that's why we exist. So in a perfect world, the government would stand up maybe regional facilities where dogs who fall into that category go and are taken care of by the government the same way, say, the VA would be set up. But until something like that happens, or I get to an age or a point in my life where I just really can't do it anymore, I'll continue to do that as long as I need to. The online training, the podcast, the personal protection dogs, police or military stuff, similarly, I'll keep doing it until I either don't want to do it anymore or it just doesn't make sense to. Dog food company, same exact thing. I'll continue to have it and operate it until it either doesn't make sense or I just don't want to do it anymore. The neat thing about kind of where I'm at and why it's so exciting for me to rediscover faith from such a magnitudinal standpoint is it's the first time in my life my kids are grown. They're out of the house in school and everything I have professionally is been going long enough to where, the learning curve isn't drinking from a fire hose and I can be pretty efficient at it without having to work 140 hours a week. And so I have this kind of time to really be able to dedicate to exploring and deepening my faith in a way that I've just never had that. I shouldn't say I've never had that. I think we all have our choices. You can spend your time day in, day out, however you want, but I never felt like it was an appropriate thing to focus on. Wrong, right, or indifferent is that I finally, professionally, personally, all things kind of moons being aligned, are in a position where I really want to spend, a significant portion of my time deepening that and exploring it further, and spending time, in nature, meditating, talking to God, to, researching, reading, just, really taking almost a kind of spiritual phase, for lack of better description, of my life, of really focusing heavy on that. And, I'll continue to train jiu-jitsu as long as, again, it makes sense, or I can. And even with all of that as kind of, here's what I have going on, here's what I want to do, I want to backdrop that with the context of, I'm always looking upstairs and saying, use me as a tool however you see fit, and you're calling the shots now. I'm along for the ride, and just the peace and solace that I take in that. Again, not being irresponsible with it, and just being, I don't have the Muslim inshallah approach of like, well, if God wants me to get out of bed today, then I will. I guess he didn't, and so I'm sticking in bed. Like, I'm not taking it to that extreme. It's more of a, I'm looking and asking for guidance day in, day out, and wherever I find direction from him in the process is where I'm going.
Well, we've talked about a lot of stuff at the table, but that's all for me. Anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, I just, well, yes, not get off my chest, but I want to mention and reiterate, one, I appreciate you having me come back on the show and in person, because they're always better in person. But two, I want to thank you for being the inspiration that you've been from a faith, and as a man, as a husband, as a father. To me, it's and I almost get kind of choked up saying it, but I'm just thankful for you, for our friendship, and for the guidance that you've given me. Even though it may not have seemed like much, I pay attention to what you do and what you say, and you've been a forceful and positive impact in my life, and I appreciate you.
I appreciate you saying that, and that's the thing, man. We're brothers in Christ now, and that's just the way it's got to be.
Amen.
All right, man. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming, www.Undaunted.Life. The music on this podcast is the song Conqueror by the Christian metal band Void Awaken. Be sure to stream their music on Spotify, Apple Music, and wherever else you get your music. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.